Pull the QRF. We are not sending reinforcements. Let them hold. Colonel Greer's voice didn't even waver as he spoke the words into the handset. He closed the radio channel with a crisp, final click, a sound that seemed far too small for the weight of the order he'd just given. He stood up from the console, the fluorescent lights of the command center reflecting off his polished oak desk, and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee. The steam rose in a gentle, mocking swirl. He sat back down, adjusted his posture, and took a slow, deliberate sip. 40 miles away, inside a jagged stone canyon that had become a furnace of iron and fire, 620 Marines were bleeding out. They were trapped, burning, and screaming for a medevac that would never come. The one man with the absolute authority to save them had just chosen the warmth of his coffee over the lives of his men. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He made his decision the way bureaucrats make decisions, cleanly, from a safe distance, with someone else paying the price in blood and bone. What he didn't know was that one woman had already decided something different, and she wasn't waiting for a signature or a green light from a command post. If you believe in the kind of courage that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that stands up when the world tells it to sit down, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell icon and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story of defiance and survival travels. Stay with me until the very end. You will not regret hearing how this unfolds. The morning Tessa called her almost died began the same way every dangerous morning begins, quietly. It was a deceptive, heavy sort of silence that draped over the mountains like a shroud. She was sitting in the back of the fourth vehicle in the convoy, a battered mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, or MRAP, that smelled like a nauseating cocktail of diesel fuel, old sweat, and the metallic tang of dry heat. Her rifle case was wedged firmly between her knees, a constant, comforting weight. Beside her on the cracked vinyl seat sat a half-eaten protein bar, forgotten and turning chalky in the rising temperature. Tessa wasn't supposed to be on this convoy at all. Her orders, cut 3 days earlier at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, designated her as an intelligence liaison. It was a desk function, a support role, a position meant for someone who looked at grainy satellite imagery, cross-referenced radio intercepts, and wrote dry, analytical reports that commanders read or, more often than not, tossed into a digital trash bin. She was 29 years old and had spent the last 4 years of her career making herself indispensable in rooms where no one ever got shot at. That was supposed to be enough. That was the career path she had been promised. But as she watched the ridgeline through the scratched, thick ballistic window of the MRAP, she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't fear, exactly. Fear had a specific, jagged texture. It lived in the chest, sharp and sudden like a physical blow. This was different. This was a slow-spreading unease, like cold water finding the microscopic cracks in a stone wall. It was the intuition of a predator sensing another predator in the tall grass. "You're doing it again," said Corporal Danny Ruiz from across the cramped interior of the vehicle. Ruiz was 22, built like a fire hydrant, and had the unfortunate habit of narrating other people's behavior when he was nervous. He was checking the action on his SAW for the 10th time that hour. The thing where you stare at nothing and your jaw goes tight like you're trying to bite through a steel cable. "I'm looking at the ridge," Tessa said, her voice low and steady. "There's nothing on the ridge," Danny replied, leaning back and trying to project a confidence he clearly didn't feel. "It's just rocks and dust, ma'am, same as the last 10 miles. "I know," she said, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "So why the death stare?" "Because there should be something," she said, finally turning to look at him. "There should be goats up there. There should be farmers tending to the terraces. There should be smoke from cook fires or kids throwing rocks at the trucks. Something. When a place that's supposed to have people in it goes completely quiet, Danny, that means the people who know something have already left." Ruiz chewed on that for a long moment, the silence of the vehicle suddenly feeling much heavier. The hum of the engine seemed to grow louder in the absence of his talking. "You want me to say something to Sergeant Holloway?" he asked, his voice losing its playful edge. "I already did," Tessa said, picking up the dry protein bar but not eating it. 20 minutes ago. He told me to stick to my lane and keep my eyes on my tablet. That was the problem with being an intelligence analyst in a combat zone. You could be right about every single variable. You could map out the enemy's intent with mathematical precision, and it still wouldn't matter if you didn't have the rank or the brass on your shoulders to back it up. Tessa had learned that lesson the hard way in 3 previous deployments. Once in the Horn of Africa, where a missed signal led to a raid going sideways. Once in a place she still wasn't allowed to talk about, even in her own head. And once in a mountain village where she had flagged a threat assessment that nobody acted on, and then spent 2 weeks afterward writing condolence summaries for families back home. She didn't enjoy being right when being right meant people died. But she had also stopped pretending she wasn't right when every nerve in her body was screaming at her to get ready. She forced herself to eat a bite of the protein bar. It tasted like sand. She kept her eyes on the ridge. Chief Nolan Pierce was in the 7th vehicle, a position he'd chosen with the calculated deliberation of a man who had survived 2 decades of small unit tactics. He was far enough back to see the shape of the convoy as a whole, to understand its rhythm and its vulnerabilities, yet close enough to the front to respond if the world ended in a heartbeat. He was 44 years old, and the years had not been gentle. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, a permanent reminder of a night in Fallujah he never explained. There was a stillness about him, a gravity that made younger Marines slightly uncomfortable, as if they were standing near a live wire they didn't fully understand. He was on his 4th radio check of the morning when he noticed it, too. The silence. He'd been in enough mountain corridors to know the difference between occupied terrain and empty terrain. Occupied terrain had ambient noise, the engines of distant tractors, the bleating of livestock, the occasional crack of small arms fire from local militias that weren't particularly organized, but liked to announce their presence to the world. This valley had none of it. It felt like the earth was holding its breath. The air was stagnant, the dust hanging motionless in the wake of the trucks. He keyed his radio, his thumb finding the button with practiced ease. "Actual, this is Pierce. Request a halt. I want to put eyes on the eastern ridgeline before we proceed through the Narrows. I don't like the look of the shadows up there." The response came back 15 seconds later, crackling with static and the unmistakable tone of a man who was tired of being questioned. It was the voice of Major Curtis Hale, the convoy commander. Hale was a man of checklists and schedules, someone who believed that the mission clock was the only god worth worshipping. "Negative, Chief. We're already 40 minutes behind schedule. We keep moving. Sir, the terrain is narrowing. We're losing our visibility on the high ground. The thermal profile of those rocks is perfect for concealment." I said keep moving, Pierce. "We push through the Narrows and we're at the FOB by 1300. That's the objective. Stay in line." Pierce released the transmit button. He didn't argue. He knew Hale's type, men who thought that bravery was the same thing as stubbornness. He looked out at the ridge line again. He looked at the walls of the pass closing in around them, the vertical rock faces becoming so close he could almost reach out and touch the ancient, sun-bleached stone. It was a choke point that any first-year tactics student would recognize as a perfect ambush corridor. It was a geographical death trap. He thought about pushing back again. He thought about rank and protocol and the specific, particular kind of career destruction that came from disobeying a direct order in front of 600 people. Then he thought about the 15 young Marines in the vehicle behind him. Kids who still had the tags on their gear and photographs of their children tucked into their chest pockets. He keyed the radio one more time, his voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as flint. "Actual. I am formally requesting a halt for terrain assessment. I want it on the record." "Noted," said Major Hale, his voice dripping with condescension. "Keep moving, Chief." Pierce set down the handset. In the seat beside him, his driver, a young lance corporal named Estes who'd been in country for exactly 11 days, gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "What happens now, Chief?" Estes asked, his voice small. Pierce looked at the boy, seeing the reflection of the towering cliffs in his goggles. "Now we get through the Narrows as fast as we can and hope to God I'm wrong." He wasn't wrong. The first RPG came without a sound. Or rather, the sound of the launch and the impact of the warhead arrived at the exact same moment, which meant there was no warning, only the brutal reality of consequence. It hit the lead vehicle, the first MRAP in the column, and the explosion was so massive that Tessa felt the shockwave through the heavy armored frame of her own vehicle 4 positions back. The lead MRAP didn't just burn, it seemed to cease being the shape it had been. The front end vanished in a blinding column of fire, black smoke, and overpressure. The multi-ton vehicle lurched sideways across the narrow road like a toy, its axles snapping as it blocked the entire passage forward. And then the ridges opened up. It wasn't a few fighters or a tentative probe. It was a coordinated, layered, and terrifyingly professional ambush. Fire erupted from multiple positions along both ridge lines simultaneously. Heavy machine guns, RPGs, and precision small arms fire. Everything was trained on a single column of vehicles that had nowhere to go. The road ahead was blocked by a wall of burning steel. The road behind was already catching fire as a second and third RPG found targets at the rear of the column, sealing the exit. The rock walls on either side were vertical, offering no exit and no cover except the vehicles themselves. And the vehicles were rapidly becoming targets. Contact left, contact right, front. The radio erupted into a chaotic symphony of overlapping voices. None of them were in control. We're pinned. We need air support. Someone get me air support now. Tessa was out of her seat before her MRAP even came to a full stop. It wasn't because she had been ordered to move. There was no order. Major Hale was screaming something on the command net about establishing a perimeter, a command that was almost comically irrelevant given that they were trapped in a stone tube with shooters on every wall. The only thing that mattered in that moment was not dying in the next 90 seconds. Ruiz, she shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire and the thud of impacts hitting the armor. Get the back door open. I need to get eyes on the eastern wall. Ma'am, protocol says we stay with the vehicle. Ruiz was shouting, his eyes wide, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his weapon. Ruiz, Tessa looked at him the way she had learned to look at men when there was no time left for the luxury of an argument. It was a look of cold, absolute authority. Open the door. Now, he hit the release. The heavy armored door swung open, and the air outside hit Tessa like a physical blow. It was a wall of heat, smoke, cordite, and the particular acrid smell of burning military-grade composite material. Rounds were snapping overhead with that specific, sharp cracking sound that meant the bullets were close enough to feel personal. She moved in a low crouch, staying tight against the bulk of the MRAP, using the massive tires for cover. She looked up. She had been right about the ridge. She was always right about the ridge. She could count at least 6 firing positions on the eastern wall alone. There were machine gun nests tucked into natural depressions in the rock, RPG operators using the lip of the ridge for cover, and riflemen spread across a 200-meter front to maximize their fields of fire. The western ridge mirrored them. The convoy was in a textbook L-shaped ambush that had been extended into a full envelope. Whoever had planned this hadn't just gotten lucky. They had performed serious reconnaissance. Someone had known this convoy was coming. That thought hit her like a second explosion, but she filed it away for later. Later was only going to exist if she did something in the next 30 seconds. She lunged back into the MRAP, grabbed her long-range rifle case and started pulling components. Her hands moved from pure muscle memory, bypassing the panic centers of her brain. She'd assembled this rifle in the dark. She'd assembled it in the rain. She'd assembled it in the back of a moving vehicle and once years ago while a man was actively trying to kill her. The familiar weight of the stock, the specific mechanical click of the bolt, the way the scope settled against her eye, it all acted as an anchor. The whole chaotic world narrowed down to a single point. "What are you doing?" Ruiz asked, staring at her as if she'd grown a second head. "You're an intel analyst." "Right now, I'm whoever can make that shot," she said. She didn't look at him. She looked through the glass. Chief Pierce was 3 vehicles back and already moving on foot before the second volley of RPGs arrived. He had his radio handset in one hand and his M4 in the other, moving with a grim, purposeful economy of motion. He was doing the thing he'd been doing for 20 years, trying to build a mental picture of a situation that was changing faster than the human mind could track. The situation, 60 seconds after the first impact, was bleak. 4 vehicles were destroyed or disabled. Approximately 30 Marines were wounded or dead from the initial blasts. The convoy was spread across 400 meters of road with no viable exit route. Enemy fighters held every piece of high ground. Air support was 15 minutes away at the absolute minimum, and the quick reaction force, the team that existed precisely for moments of total disaster, was parked at FOB Kestrel, 40 miles away. He got on the command net, his voice cutting through the panic like a knife. "Actual, this is Pierce. We need the QRF launched immediately. We are in a full ambush. Multiple casualties, roadblock front and rear. QRF needs to move now." The response, when it came, didn't come from Major Hale. It was a voice Pierce recognized instantly. Colonel Warren Greer, the brigade commander, speaking from the fortified safety of the command post where the coffee was hot and the air was conditioned. "Pierce, this is Greer. What is your assessment of holding capability? Negative holding capability, sir. Pierce barked, ducking as a burst of machine gun fire chewed into the pavement near his boots. We are in a kill box. We need reinforcements, and we need them moving in the next 5 minutes, or you're going to be writing 600 letters to parents. There was a pause, a long, agonizing pause. The kind of pause that meant a conversation was happening on the other end that wasn't being recorded, a calculation being made that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with optics and risk. Then Greer spoke again. Pull the QRF. We are not sending reinforcements. Let them hold. Pierce stood in the middle of a literal storm of lead and heard those words. He felt something he hadn't felt in 2 decades of combat, a genuine, clarifying disbelief. It wasn't the kind of shock that makes you freeze. It was the kind that makes everything suddenly, coldly simple. All the rules, all the protocols, all the loyalty he had built his life around evaporated in the heat of that betrayal. Say again, sir. You heard me, Chief. Hold your position. QRF is not available. Sir, with respect, we have 30 confirmed wounded and counting. We are taking fire from elevated positions on both sides, and we have 0 exit. Not available is not an operational status. What is the actual reason the QRF is not moving? The radio went quiet for a beat. When Greer returned, his voice was like ice. That is a command decision, Pierce. Maintain your position. The channel clicked off. Pierce stood there for 2 seconds, the world exploding around him. Then he turned to the Marine beside him, a veteran sergeant named Kowalski who had been with Pierce through 3 tours. Kowalski didn't need to ask. He saw the look on the chief's face and knew the cavalry wasn't coming. We're on our own, Pierce said. What do we do? Kowalski asked, his voice steady despite the chaos. Pierce looked up at the ridge line. He looked at the burning wreckage of the lead vehicle. He looked at the Marines crouching behind whatever cover they could find, their ammunition being spent at a rate that was going to create a terminal problem in about 6 minutes. We fight our way out, Pierce said. Get me a runner to every vehicle commander. I want everyone moving toward the front of the column in 60 seconds. We push through the blockage. We don't wait for anyone to clear the road for us. We push through the burning MRAP. If we have to ram it off the road with another vehicle, that's what we do. But we are not dying in this canyon. Pierce started moving toward the front, rounds snapping past him, and he shouted one more thing over his shoulder. And someone find out who's been shooting from the 3rd vehicle position, because whoever that is just took down a machine gun nest, and I want to know their name. Tessa had taken down 2 firing positions in 4 minutes. She knew it wasn't a sustainable pace given the number of targets, but it was a start. The first shot had been the hardest, not because of the distance or the wind, which she had calculated with the cold precision of an algorithm, but because of the noise. The ambient cacophony of an active firefight does something specific to a shooter's concentration. It creates a false urgency, a frantic pressure to move faster than accuracy allows. A shooter who gives into that pressure is a shooter who misses. She had spent years learning how to build a wall around her mind. She breathed out, feeling the air leave her lungs in a slow, controlled stream. She squeezed, didn't pull, squeezed the trigger. The machine gunner on the eastern ridge, the man who had been pinning down the front of the column, dropped instantly. His weapon fell silent, the belt of ammunition dangling uselessly over the rocks. The second shot came 17 seconds later. The enemy fighters hadn't yet registered where the first shot had come from. An RPG operator on the western ridge was already tracking a vehicle near the rear. Tessa put the crosshairs just ahead of his shoulder, accounted for the slight updraft from the burning trucks, and fired. He went down hard, the launcher clattering off the ridge and disappearing into the depths of the canyon. The third shot was harder. They'd found her, or at least they'd found the general area she was shooting from. Dust began to kick up around her as multiple riflemen shifted their fire toward the MRAP. She needed to move, and moving while maintaining precision was an exercise in controlled chaos. Ruiz, she shouted, I need suppressive fire on the eastern ridge. Right-hand cluster of rocks, 2 o'clock from that burning vehicle at the front. Give me 15 seconds. I'm a vehicle gunner, Nada. Ruiz started to protest, but the look on her face stopped him. He grabbed his SAW and began to pour lead into the ridge. The crack of Ruiz's weapon was a rhythmic, comforting roar. Tessa moved in a low, frantic scramble 20 meters to the left, finding a new position behind a rocky outcrop that the MRAP had partially shielded from the eastern shooters. She slid into the dirt, re-established her bipod, and required her targets. There were more of them than she'd initially counted. A lot more. She had a calm, pragmatic thought. This was going to take a long time. She started working left to right, systematically, the way she'd been taught during a 3-week stint at a sniper school she technically hadn't been authorized to attend. She'd argued her way into the course by pointing out that an intelligence analyst who understood sniper methodology could write better threat assessments. It was a lie, or at least a partial truth. Her actual motivation was that she had spent her career watching other people make the shots and had wanted very badly to know if she could do it when the world was on fire. She could. 4 positions. 5. 6. The pressure on the forward vehicles was beginning to ease, just by a fraction. She could hear it in the radio chatter Ruiz was relaying. The voices were shifting from pure, unadulterated panic to something slightly more organized. The Marine brain was beginning to reassert itself as the immediate threat dropped from overwhelming to merely catastrophic. And then she heard Pierce's voice on the net. It was a voice of absolute, terrifying calm. "All elements, this is Pierce. We are moving. Vehicle commanders, start your engines. We push north through the blockage on my mark. Anyone who can walk, walks. Anyone who can't, rides. Nobody gets left in this canyon. Is that understood?" The responses came back broken and overlapping, some of them from Marines who were clearly shooting and running at the same time, but they came back. "Understood. Copy that. Moving." Tessa looked at the ridgeline one last time. There was still a major threat at the far north end, an RPG position that had remained strangely quiet during the initial firefight. That meant it was either a reserve position or they were waiting for the convoy to move. If Pierce was going to push the convoy out, that position was going to open up at the exact moment the vehicles were most vulnerable. She looked at the distance. She did the math in her head. Elevation, probable wind at the ridge level versus the stagnant air at her position, the way the late morning sun was hitting the rock face and creating a thermal shimmer that would distort the image. It was a long shot. It was the longest shot she'd ever attempted in her life. She had one chance before the convoy began its push and gave the operator a moving target. She settled the rifle. She breathed. She found the stillness she'd spent years carrying inside her. The radio crackled with Pierce's countdown. "All elements prepare to move. 30 seconds. 29. 28. Tessa squeezed the trigger. The RPG operator on the North Ridge dropped before he ever had the chance to raise the launcher. A split second later, the lead vehicles began to roar, their engines straining as they slammed into the wreckage blocking the road. It took 11 minutes to push through the north end of the canyon. Those 11 minutes were some of the longest in Tessa Calder's life. She didn't stay in the vehicle. She moved with the convoy on foot, staying in the dead space between the moving trucks and the canyon wall, covering the high angles that the vehicle-mounted guns couldn't reach. Ruiz stayed right with her, covering her flanks without being asked. He didn't say a word. He just watched her back with a grim intensity she would never forget. The enemy fighters adapted, as she knew they would. Those who were left, she had personally taken down 11 firing positions, but dozens remained, shifted their fire to track the moving column. This changed the ballistic problem entirely. Shooting at stationary targets from a stationary position is science. Shooting at moving targets while you yourself are moving is something closer to art, or perhaps controlled instinct. There were moments in those 11 minutes where Tessa operated on a plane she couldn't have explained. She didn't miss. She didn't even know anyone was counting until much later. The lead element of the convoy finally broke out of the north end of the canyon at 11:47 a.m. The vehicles behind followed in a grinding, lurching rush. Some were on flat tires, sparks flying from shredded rims. One had a gunner who had been shot through the shoulder but refused to let go of his weapon until the sky opened up and the canyon walls receded. Tessa was among the last to emerge, not because she couldn't have left sooner, but because she'd found a wounded Marine, a young lance corporal who'd taken shrapnel to both legs and had been separated from his squad when his vehicle was hit. She'd found him in the chaos, hoisted him up, and half-carried him while keeping her rifle in her right hand. It wasn't textbook. It wasn't Intel liaison protocol. It was simply what was required. She came out into the blinding midday sun of the valley beyond and sat down on the dusty earth because her legs finally informed her they were finished. Ruiz sat down beside her, his chest heaving. "You okay?" He managed to gasp. "No," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "You need a medic," Danny said, looking at the blood on her sleeve. "Not yet." She looked back at the mouth of the canyon. The last vehicle was clearing the bottleneck, its engine screaming. "Count them," she said. "Tell me they all came out." Ruiz stood up, shielding his eyes. His lips moved as he counted the battered, smoking shapes. He looked back at her, his expression a mix of awe and exhaustion. All of them, he said. Every vehicle, every Marine. Tessa nodded. She looked at her hands. They were steady, which felt strange because the rest of her felt like it was made of glass. Every bone felt brittle. Every muscle felt like it was operating on a reserve battery that was about to go dark. You know, Ruiz said after a minute, you're going to have a hell of a lot of explaining to do. Protocol-wise, about the shooting, about moving without orders, about, well, everything. I know, she said. You care. Tessa thought about Colonel Greer sitting in his air-conditioned office 40 miles away. She thought about the click of the radio as he abandoned 600 men to die. She thought about the weight of the lance corporal she had just carried out. Ask me again in a week, she said. Somewhere behind them, she could hear Pierce's voice. He was already organizing the casualty count, calling in the medevacs, doing the 1,000 professional things that needed to be done in the wake of a disaster. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had refused to let it break him. She understood that voice now. She had been working toward it her entire career, and she had finally found it in the middle of a slaughterhouse. She picked up her rifle, checked the chamber out of habit, and looked at the jagged mountains. They were still there, silent and indifferent, but they hadn't won. Not today. The silence, she'd noticed that morning, was a living thing now. A heavy, suffocating blanket that refused to lift even as the world around her screamed with the sounds of machinery and weary men. Tessa Calder sat in the grit, her back against a jagged outcropping of rock that still radiated the day's brutal heat, and she thought about the goats. It seemed such a small thing in the grand, bloody scheme of the afternoon, but the absence of those animals on the ridgelines had been the first note of a symphony that had ended in fire. The empty ridgelines, the missing shepherds, the held breath of a valley that had been waiting for something terrible to happen. It all pointed toward a single, freezing reality. Someone had known this convoy was coming. Someone had cleared the stage so the massacre could begin without witnesses. That thought remained at the back of her mind, patient and cold, like a predator waiting for the sun to go down. She knew she would have to examine it eventually. She would have to pull it apart, thread by thread, until she found the leak, but she couldn't do it yet. Her mind was a crowded room, and right now there was no space for detective work. Today, she was simply going to exist in the dirt. She was going to let her legs rest, feeling the dull, rhythmic throb in her muscles, and she was going to listen to the sound of the medevac helicopters as they crested the ridge. The sound of the rotors was a physical weight, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the air in her lungs. She started to count them. It was a habit she developed early in her training, a way to anchor herself when the world started to tilt. Counting was how you confirmed that the things you needed to be true were actually happening. One helicopter, a speck of dust against the blinding blue of the Afghan sky. Two, banking hard as it descended toward the improvised landing zone. Three, she did the math in her head. 3 birds, enough room for the litter cases, enough room for the boys who were currently bleeding through their field dressings. It was enough. She closed her eyes and let the mechanical roar fill her head, drowning out the echoes of the gunfire that still rang in her ears. She had taken lives today. She didn't try to soften the thought or dress it up in the sanitized language of engagement. She had looked through a glass lens, adjusted for windage and elevation, and she had ended human lives to ensure that others could keep theirs. That was the arithmetic of the work. It was a bargain she had made with herself long ago, a contract signed in the quiet hours of training when the targets were made of paper and didn't bleed. But knowing the arithmetic in the abstract and carrying the actual sum in your body were 2 very different burdens. She could feel that second weight settling into her marrow now, not crushing, not a sudden collapse, but a permanent change in her center of gravity. She was a different person than the one who had woken up that morning, and she would be this new person for the rest of her life. Beside her, Ruiz was a silent statue of dust and sweat. He didn't offer any platitudes, and for that, she was profoundly grateful. He was a smart enough Marine to know that this was not a moment for words or comforts. He simply sat there, his rifle across his lap, a silent witness to the quietude that follows a storm. Behind them, the survivors were beginning the slow, agonizing process of becoming a unit again. The Marines were organizing, regrouping, pulling functionality out of the raw material of chaos and adrenaline. It was a testament to the sheer stubbornness of the human spirit. Voices drifted across the clearing, calling out names and waiting for the responses that confirmed who was still among the living. A sergeant was already moving from man to man, his voice a steady, rhythmic bark as he conducted an ammunition inventory, turning the horror of the ambush into a series of numbers on a ledger. Somewhere nearby, someone had actually managed to get a portable burner going. The scent of coffee, sharp and impossibly ordinary, began to drift through the air. To Tessa, the smell felt like a hallucination. It was a domestic scent, a morning scent, entirely out of place in a canyon that smelled of ozone, copper, and burned rubber. She opened her eyes when she felt a change in the air, a shifting of the light. Chief Nolan Pierce was walking toward her. He moved with the same deliberate, unhurried gait he'd used for 20 years, a walk that didn't just carry him forward, but seemed to claim the ground beneath his feet. It was the kind of walk that told anyone watching, "I have seen worse than this, and I will undoubtedly see worse again. And right now, I am choosing to be exactly where my feet are." There was no panic in him, no frantic energy, just a terrifyingly calm competence. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling across her dusty boots. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face not for injury, but for something deeper. Tessa looked back at him, and in that silence, something passed between them that had no clean name in any language. It was a recognition of shared space, a mutual understanding of the cost of the last few hours. Then, to her immense surprise, Pierce sat down on the ground beside her. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. Nolan Pierce did not sit on the ground in the middle of an operation. He was a man who stood, who moved, who planned, who commanded. Seeing him drop into the dirt was like seeing a mountain decide to take a rest. 11 positions, he said, his voice like gravel grinding together. That's what we counted. Tessa exhaled a breath she didn't know she was holding. I lost track, she admitted. Her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. I know, Pierce said. He was quiet for a while, looking out at the jagged teeth of the mountains. That last shot, at the north end of the canyon, what was the distance? Tessa didn't have to think about it. The numbers were burned into her mind. She gave him the figure, the wind adjustment she'd made, the lead she'd taken on the moving target. Pierce went silent again, his eyes narrowing as he did the internal math. He'd been a shooter long before he'd been a chief. He knew exactly what that shot entailed. How long have you been able to do that? He asked finally. A while, she replied, and nobody knew. I knew, she said, and there was no pride in the statement, only a flat acknowledgement of a fact. Pierce nodded slowly, as if that answer filled a gap in a puzzle he'd been working on since the first shot was fired. He didn't ask why she'd hidden it. In their world, secrets were often the only things that belonged to you. He looked out at the horizon, where the gold of the afternoon was beginning to stretch into long, bruised shadows. Major Hale is going to request a formal review of your actions today, Pierce said, his tone shifting back to the professional neutrality of a senior leader. Unauthorized weapons employment, failure to maintain an assigned position, operating outside the scope of your designated role as an intelligence liaison. He paused, letting the weight of those charges hang in the air. The list goes on. It's a long list, Tessa. I know, she said. You're not worried? I'm very worried, she said, looking him in the eye. But I'd do it again every single shot. I know that too, Pierce said. He stood up then because even for a man like him, the dirt was only a temporary resting place. He looked down at her with an expression she would carry with her for years. It wasn't pity and it wasn't exactly admiration. It was something far more precise, recognition. It was the look one survivor gives another when they both know they've crossed a line they can never step back over. It was the look of a man who had operated in the dark spaces for a long time and understood the particular, soul-deep weight of decisions made in a fraction of a second. Get some water, he commanded. The debrief starts in an hour. He walked away, leaving her in the lengthening shadows. Ruiz, who had been listening without appearing to listen, handed her a water bottle from a side pocket of his pack. She took it, the plastic crinkling in her shaking hand, and drank until her throat stopped burning. Above the valley, the sky was turning into a breathtaking canvas of gold and violet, a beautiful end to a hideous day. The helicopters were lifting off now, their bellies full of the wounded, rising like dragonflies toward the safety of the base. The canyon behind her was finally, mercifully quiet. The debrief didn't wait for an hour. It started in 40 minutes because Major Curtis Hale was a man who viewed patience as a form of weakness. He was uncomfortable, and when Hale was uncomfortable, he wanted everyone around him to feel the friction. Tessa Calder made him profoundly, deeply uncomfortable. She was a variable he hadn't accounted for, a break in the neatly ordered chain of command he relied on to maintain his sense of self. She walked into the improvised command tent, which was really just a massive stretch of heavy canvas staked out between two armored vehicles. It had been erected with the grim, mechanical efficiency of people who had done this in 100 different deserts. As soon as she stepped into the shaded interior, the air felt different, colder, sharper, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the electric tension of a looming confrontation. She knew immediately that this was not a debrief. A debrief was a collaborative effort to reconstruct the truth. This was an interrogation. Major Hale was standing at the far end of the tent, silhouetted against the bright light leaking in through the gaps in the canvas. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He was a man who had already decided what the truth was and was now simply waiting for the world to align with his version of it. Beside him stood Lieutenant Adrian Locke, Tessa's direct superior in the intelligence section. Locke looked pained, his eyes downcast as if he were trying to find a way to be somewhere else entirely. Two other officers she didn't recognize flanked the makeshift table, and a young sergeant sat at the end with a digital recorder and a notepad, his pen poised like a weapon. Tessa didn't wait for an invitation. She sat down in one of the folding chairs. She hadn't been offered a seat, but she took one anyway. The act of sitting felt like a small rebellion, a refusal to be intimidated by the rank in the room. "Petty Officer Calder," Hale began. He spoke her rank and name as if they were an insult, each syllable weighted with the deliberate enunciation of a man reminding an inferior of the vast distance between them. "Would you like to explain to me what exactly you were doing for the last 3 hours?" "Keeping your Marines alive, sir," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded an explosion. Locke closed his eyes briefly, a flicker of genuine distress crossing his face. He looked like a man watching a train wreck in slow motion, unable to look away but desperate to stop the impact. Hale's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. "That was not your assignment, Petty Officer. Your assignment, the one I personally reviewed and authorized, placed you as an intelligence liaison, a support function. You were to remain with the vehicle, document the engagement for after-action reporting, and stay out of the way of the people whose job it actually is to fight this war." Tessa kept her voice level. She made it the specific temperature of a surgical instrument, cold, precise, and devoid of emotion. "With respect, sir, the people whose job it actually is to fight were pinned behind burning vehicles with no exit route. They were being picked off in a kill zone because the quick reaction force that was requested never arrived. I identified a capability that was desperately needed, and I applied it. That is exactly what intelligence officers are trained to do. We adapt to the environment." "You are not a sniper," Hale hissed, leaning over the table. "No, sir," Tessa replied, her gaze never wavering. "I was better than a sniper today, which is why 11 of their firing positions are no longer functional and 620 of your Marines are still breathing. They're alive to sit in this tent with you because I didn't stay in my lane." Locke made a small, choked sound that might have been a cough or a stifled laugh. Hale took 2 steps forward, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that was infinitely worse than shouting. "You are going to stand there and tell me that you violated your assigned role, discharged a weapon without authorization, operated outside the perimeter of your designated position, and exposed yourself and other personnel to unnecessary risk. And you're going to call that following your training?" "Yes, sir," Tessa said. "That's exactly what I'm going to call it." The atmosphere in the tent was stifling. Tessa could feel the sergeant with the recorder trying to shrink into his chair, trying to become invisible so he wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. Then the tent flap was brushed aside and Chief Pierce walked in. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't knock. He simply entered the space as if he owned it, which, by the laws of seniority and respect, he practically did. "Major," Pierce said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of rank, nothing more. Hale turned, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Chief Pierce, I didn't request your presence at this debrief." "No, sir," Pierce said, walking to the table with a slow, heavy confidence. "I requested my own." He placed a piece of paper on the table, a handwritten list, the names and times scrawled in the hurried script of the field. 11 documented enemy firing positions neutralized. Timeline reconstructed from multiple witness accounts across 6 different vehicle positions. "I have the names of 13 Marines who are willing to testify on the record that the neutralization of those positions is the only reason the convoy was able to push through the north end of the canyon." He looked at Hale with a steady, unblinking gaze. I'm happy to read the names aloud if you'd like. That won't be necessary, Hale snapped. Respectfully, sir, I think it will be, Pierce countered. Because there is going to be a formal review of today's action, and that review is going to ask why the QRF was held back. It's going to ask why the air support was delayed, and I want to make sure the record reflects exactly what happened when those Marines were left alone in that canyon. The temperature in the tent plummeted. Locke, who had been trying to fade into the background, suddenly became very still. This was no longer about a petty officer breaking protocol. This was about a much larger failure of command. That is a command decision that is far above your pay grade, Chief, Hale said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. Yes, sir, it's above mine and it's above yours, Pierce said, which is exactly why I think Colonel Greer should be the one answering questions about it, rather than Petty Officer Calder. I'd hate for the investigation to stop at this tent when the orders came from much higher up. Pierce picked up his list, his eyes flicking to Tessa for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a signal of comfort, just a professional nod, one soldier to another. I'll be submitting this documentation through the formal after-action channels. I wanted you to know it exists before the paper trail becomes permanent. He turned and walked out, the tent flap fluttering in his wake. Hale stood there for a long moment, the silence of the tent feeling like a physical pressure. He was a man who had just been outmaneuvered, and he was clearly weighing the cost of his next move. Finally, he turned his gaze back to Tessa. This review is not over, he said, his voice cold and thin. I didn't think it was, sir, she replied. You are confined to support functions until further notice. No weapons, no field movement. You will sit at a desk and you will write reports until I decide otherwise. Are we clear? Yes, sir. Dismissed. Tessa stood and walked out of the tent. Outside, the harsh afternoon light was beginning to fade, but the smell of the canyon, that mixture of burned metal and ancient dust, was still thick in the air. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her chest loosen just a fraction. She had survived the ambush, and she had survived the major. Now she just had to survive the aftermath. Ruiz was waiting for her just outside the perimeter of the command area. He was leaning against a tire, looking like he hadn't moved an inch since she'd left him. How bad? He asked. Confined to a desk pending review, she said. Ruiz winced. Could have been worse. Could have been better, she countered. They're going after me because it's easier than going after the people who actually made the mistakes. They want a scapegoat to protect Greer. Ruiz was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the busy activity of the camp. And is that what Pierce was doing in there, stopping them? Yeah, Tessa said. That's exactly what he was doing. They started walking toward the medical area. Tessa felt a sudden, urgent need to see the faces of the people who were still alive. She wanted to check on the lance corporal she had dragged out of the canyon, the kid with the shrapnel in his legs whose name she hadn't known in the heat of the moment. She felt like she owed it to him to learn his name now in the quiet. The medical area was a scene of organized, high-stakes chaos. In the military, medicine is a brutal, efficient machine. The wounded were sorted and stabilized with a speed born of tragic repetition. Medics moved between the litters with blood-stained gloves, their faces masks of grim concentration. Tessa hated how normal it looked. She hated that this level of trauma could be turned into a routine, a series of boxes to be checked by people who had seen so much blood that it no longer shocked them. She found the lance corporal in the third row of the triage tent. His name, printed clearly on the tag pin to his uniform, was Eastwick. James Eastwick, 20 years old, hailing from a small town in Ohio. He was conscious, which was a miracle given how much blood he'd left on the canyon floor. His skin was the color of wet ash, that specific gray pallor that comes when the body is struggling to stay in the world. When Tessa crouched down beside him, his eyes flickered open. They were bright with pain, but surprisingly clear. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. "How are you holding up, Eastwick?" "Both legs hurt like hell," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. "Medic says I might keep them both, though. Better than the alternative, right?" He looked at her for a moment, his gaze drifting to the rifle case slung over her shoulder. You're the one who got me out. I remember your boots. I was staring at them while you were dragging me." "I was going that direction anyway," she said. "Almost," he whispered. "My squad leader. He told me someone was shooting from inside the canyon, taking down the positions that had us pinned. Was that you?" "Yes," she said. "How many?" 11, she replied. Eastwick was quiet for a long time, the information sinking in. He looked at the ceiling of the tent, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. There were 260 guys in my unit alone, he said. More in the trucks behind us. I'm bad at math, but that's a lot of lives. You don't need to do the math, James, she said. No, he agreed. I guess I don't. He looked at her again, and for a second the 20-year-old boy from Ohio was gone, replaced by a man who had seen the end of the world and survived it. Thank you. Tessa didn't say you're welcome. The words felt too small, too hollow for the space they were in. Instead, she just squeezed his hand briefly. Get some rest. Let the medics do their job. You've got to get back to Ohio. He nodded, his eyes closing as the exhaustion finally took him. Tessa stood up, feeling a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She had saved him, but she knew that the James Eastwick who went back to Ohio wouldn't be the same one who had left it. She walked away before she could say anything else, before the weight of it all could pull her down. Ruiz fell back into step with her. He'd been waiting by the entrance of the tent, a silent shadow. He looked at her arm. You need to eat, he said, and you need to sleep, and someone needs to look at that cut before it gets ugly. Tessa looked down at her left forearm. There was a long, jagged slice through her sleeve, the fabric stiff with dried blood. She hadn't even noticed it happening. She couldn't remember a single moment where she'd felt a blade or a piece of shrapnel catch her. It's just a scratch, she said. I'll throw a field dressing on it. Absolutely not, Ruiz said, his voice taking on a rare edge of authority. You carried a Marine out of a death trap on one arm and you didn't stop to get yourself checked out. You're going to sit down and let a professional look at that. That's the deal. What deal? The one I'm making right now, he said. You saved my life 3 times today. My one request is that you don't die of a stupid infection because you're too stubborn to sit in a chair for 5 minutes. Tessa sighed and sat down on a nearby crate. A young medic named Specialist Torres appeared almost instantly. She was a whirlwind of brisk, no-nonsense energy, the kind of person who survived the horrors of the field by focusing entirely on the task in front of her. She cleaned the wound with a sting that made Tessa's eyes water, closed it with sterile strips, and wrapped it in a clean white bandage, all in under 4 minutes. It was a masterclass in efficiency. As Torres moved on to the next patient, Chief Pierce materialized again. He had an uncanny ability to appear exactly where the tension was highest, a skill likely honed over 2 decades of managing the chaos of men at war. He sat on the ground beside her again, and Tessa knew this was the real conversation. Greer is going to try to bury the QRF decision, Pierce said, skipping the pleasantries. He was a man who didn't waste breath on things that didn't matter. He's going to frame it as a tactical judgment call. He'll use phrases like inadequate intelligence and unclear threat levels. He'll make a catastrophic failure sound like a reasonable choice made in the heat of the moment. Can he actually get away with that? Tessa asked. He can try, Pierce said. Whether he succeeds depends entirely on what the official record looks like. That's why I pushed that documentation through before the debrief was even cold. Once it's in the system, it exists. He can try to ignore it, but he can't make it go away. Tessa looked at the white bandage on her arm. You're going to make a lot of enemies doing this, Chief. You're putting your neck on the line for a petty officer who broke every rule in the book. Pierce snorted a dry, humorless sound. I've been making enemies since 2004, Tessa. A few more colonels on the list won't change my sleep schedule. What I want to know is if you understand what's actually coming for you. It's not just the review. What else? Greer isn't the only problem, Pierce explained, his voice lowering. Hale is just a middle manager running interference. The real issue is that you have direct knowledge. You were on the command net. You heard Greer's voice. You heard him say, let them hold while men were dying. That makes you a witness to a decision that could end a 30-year career. It might even trigger a criminal investigation. That makes you inconvenient. Inconvenient, Tessa repeated the word, feeling its weight. In my experience, Pierce said, inconvenient people usually go one of 2 ways. They either get very quiet or they get very loud. The quiet ones get reassigned to a basement in Nebraska and forgotten. The loud ones, they get investigated, they get discredited. Their records are picked apart until someone finds enough dirt to bury them. He paused, looking her directly in the eyes. There's a third option, but it's the hardest. It requires documentation, it requires witnesses, and it requires someone willing to sit with you through a process that will be long, ugly, and potentially career-ending for everyone involved. It's not a path to a medal, Tessa, it's a path to a fight. What is the third option? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Tell the truth, Pierce said. Completely, formally, on the record, every detail. The warning you gave Sergeant Holloway about the ridgeline. Your assessment of the terrain. what you heard on the command net, what you did in the canyon and exactly why you did it. It's the only play that doesn't require you to be something other than what you are. Torres, the medic, finished her work nearby and moved away, her professional discretion allowing the conversation to remain private. Tessa looked at her hands. She flexed them, feeling the tug of the bandage against her skin. "If I go on record about Greer," she said, "Hale's little review will be the least of my problems. They'll come after my shooting record. They'll look at my training history. They'll find a way to make those 11 shots look like a liability instead of a miracle." "Probably," Pierce agreed. "And even then it might not matter. Greer has 30 years of connections and institutional protection. The system is designed to protect people like him." Tessa breathed out slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "So why are you telling me to do it? If the odds are that bad, why bother?" Pierce was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with care. "Because 620 people came out of that canyon today," he said finally. "And the only reason they did is that you looked at a situation where every protocol told you to stay in your lane, and you decided the protocol was wrong. You made a judgment call based on what was real, not what was official. I'm asking you to do the same thing now. Don't let them turn what happened today into a sanitized report. Keep it real." Tessa thought about the command channel clicking off. She thought about the cold, indifferent tone in Greer's voice when he told them to hold. She thought about James Eastwick, 20 years old, bleeding out in the dirt because a man with a bird on his shoulder didn't want to risk his statistics. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." "Okay," Pierce said. He stood up, looking down at her one last time with that look of recognition. "Get some sleep first. You can't fight this kind of war on an empty tank." He walked away, fading into the shadows of the camp. Ruiz, who had been sitting 6 feet away pretending to clean a piece of equipment that was already spotless, looked up. "So what are we doing?" "We're going on record," she said, "against a full-bird colonel." Ruiz didn't even blink. He just nodded slowly, as if she'd suggested they go grab a cup of coffee. "Okay," he said. "I was there for the whole thing. I heard the net. I saw the shots. I'm in." Tessa looked at him, surprised. "Ruiz, you don't have to do this. You have a clean record. Don't throw it away for me." "Don't do that," Ruiz said, his voice flat. "Don't do the thing where you tell me I don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm telling you I'm going to. You didn't ask me if I wanted to cover you in that canyon, Tessa. You just told me what you needed and trusted me to do it. Same thing now. We're a team." Something shifted in her chest, a feeling of warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "Thanks, Danny. Don't mention it," he said, picking up his M249 and resting it across his knees. "Seriously, if you mention it, I'll deny the whole thing and tell them you're hallucinating from blood loss." Tessa actually laughed. It was a short, quiet sound, but it felt like a massive release of pressure. It was the first time she'd felt human since the first RPG had hit the lead vehicle. The afternoon bled into evening. The medevac helicopters finished their runs, leaving the camp in a strange, hollowed-out kind of quiet. The remaining vehicles were being reorganized, their scarred metal husks a reminder of how close they had all come to staying in that canyon forever. Sergeants moved through the ranks, counting everything: ammunition, fuel, water, men. Tessa watched the sunset from her crate, trying to burn the details of the day into her memory. She knew that time had a way of smoothing out the jagged edges of trauma, turning a nightmare into a story that felt manageable. She couldn't let that happen. She needed those sharp edges. She needed to remember exactly how the air felt when the QRF didn't show up. She needed to remember the exact cadence of Greer's voice. She would not let the truth get smooth. At 7:12 p.m., the first stars began to poke through the deepening purple of the sky. The war was still out there, waiting beyond the perimeter, but for tonight, the fight was internal. Tessa Calder, a woman who was supposed to be a support function, stood up and began to walk toward the admin tent. She had a story to tell, and she was going to make sure every single word was on the record. She was no longer just an observer. She was the witness, the shooter, and the one who would make them listen. As she walked, she didn't look back at the canyon. Her eyes were fixed on the light ahead, where the battle for the truth was just beginning. The shadows of the valley were deepening into a bruised purple when the runner arrived. He came from the direction of the command vehicle, his boots kicking up thin plumes of dust that hung listlessly in the cooling air. He looked exhausted, his face a mask of grime and salt-streaked sweat, but his eyes were sharp with the importance of his errand. He didn't say a word as he reached Tessa. He simply handed her a single piece of paper, folded into a neat, sharp-edged rectangle. It had been produced by the field printer in the communications section, the ink slightly faded but the 3 typed lines perfectly legible. Tessa took the paper, her fingers brushing against the runner's cold skin. She read it once, her eyes scanning the clinical typeface. Then she read it again, slower this time, letting the implications of the words sink in. Without a word, she handed the message to Ruiz. He took it with a slight frown, his heavy brow furrowing as he absorbed the contents. As he read, his face went through a rapid-fire succession of 3 distinct expressions in the span of perhaps 2 seconds. First, a flash of surprise, then a hardening of his jaw that signaled suspicion, and finally a look of profound, weary realization. He looked up at her, the paper held between 2 thick fingers. He asked if this was truly from Colonel Greer. Tessa nodded. She confirmed that the colonel wanted a private meeting tonight. Ruiz's voice was low, gravelly with the dust of the day. He noted that it was just for her, no representation, no witnesses. Tessa nodded again. She knew exactly what it meant. Ruiz set the paper down on the edge of a crate, smoothing it out with a deliberation that bordered on the ritualistic. He looked at her, his eyes dark and searching in the twilight. He told her plainly that Greer wasn't going to apologize. Tessa met his gaze steadily. She told him she knew. She understood the architecture of power better than most gave her credit for. Ruiz continued, his voice tight. He explained that Greer was going to try to figure out what she knew, how much she'd seen, and what she planned to do with that information. It was an interrogation disguised as a conversation, a tactical assessment of a potential threat to his career. Tessa didn't blink. She told him she knew that, too. She thought of Pierce's advice, the hard, crystalline wisdom of a man who had survived 1,000 such political minefields. Tell the truth, he had told her. Completely, formally, and on the record. She thought about James Eastwick's face, the raw relief and the ghost of a smile when she had told him he was going back to Ohio, that he had survived the unsurvivable. She thought about Major Hale's voice during the debriefing, each syllable heavy, deliberate, and weighted with a hidden agenda. She remembered the way the sergeant with the recorder had tried to shrink into the shadows, to be invisible, to be a ghost in the room. She folded the message back into thirds, the paper creasing with a sharp, final snap. She told Ruiz she was going to the meeting. She was going to listen to every word Greer said. And then she said she was going to remember all of it. She looked at Ruiz with an intensity that made him pause. She told him she would remember it exactly the way she remembered every word Greer had spoken over the radio during the height of the ambush. Ruiz stared at her for a long moment, the silence between them filled with the distant hum of the camp. Then something shifted in his expression. It was a look of recognition, of newfound respect. It was the specific look of a man who had just understood the shape of a plan he wasn't fully privy to, but which he realized was far more sophisticated than he had imagined. "You're going to let him talk," Ruiz said, the realization dawning on him. "You're going to let him make his case, sit there and hear every justification, every excuse, every lie. And then," he finished for her, "you're going to walk out of that vehicle and put every single bit of it into your formal statement." Tessa didn't deny it. She noted that Greer was smart, but he suffered from the same fatal flaw as many in his position. He was the kind of man who habitually underestimated people he had already decided were beneath him. He was going to walk into that meeting thinking he was dealing with a nervous junior enlisted woman who could be managed, flattered, or intimidated into silence. She tucked the message into her jacket pocket, her fingers grazing the cold fabric. She whispered that he was going to be very wrong about that. The darkness finally settled over the valley, soft and indifferent. It was the same darkness that descended every night, regardless of the blood that had been spilled or the lives that had been altered in the light of day. Somewhere in the far distance, the rhythmic thump-thump of a helicopter's rotors echoed off the canyon walls, its navigation lights cutting lonely, rhythmic streaks across the star-speckled sky. Closer by, a generator coughed to life with a metallic rattle, followed by another, and then another, until the entire temporary camp was vibrating with the hum of borrowed power. The smell of diesel and dry earth hung heavy in the air. Tessa stood up, her body protesting the movement. Her arm ached where Torres had dressed the cut, a dull, pulsing throb that reminded her of the jagged metal and the heat of the fight. Her legs were heavy, ached from hours of frantic movement and the crushing weight of adrenaline. But there was a deeper ache, too, something located somewhere beneath the muscle, in a place she didn't have the language for. It was a spiritual exhaustion, a hollow feeling that she knew was going to stay with her for a long time. She picked up her rifle case and slung it over her shoulder, the weight familiar and grounding. She looked at Ruiz and told him to get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. He asked about her, and she simply replied that she had a meeting. She began the walk toward the command vehicle, moving through the labyrinth of tents and equipment. She was walking toward whatever Colonel Warren Greer had to say to her, toward the next phase of a fight that had begun in the dust of a canyon and was now moving into the sterile, high-stakes world of command reviews. She walked the way Pierce walked, deliberate, unhurried, each step measured. She didn't feel that way inside. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest, but she understood now why the appearance of composure mattered. You walk like you know where you're going, even when you don't. Especially when you don't. It was the only way to carry the weight of the truth. The camp was a hive of activity around her. Marines were engaged in the thousands small, mundane tasks that added up to staying alive and staying ready. They were cleaning weapons, checking comms, sharing whispered jokes to ward off the trauma of the day. Tessa moved through them like she belonged there because she did. The day's events had forged a bond that no review board or colonel could ever undo. Behind her in the medical tent, James Eastwick was sleeping the deep, drug-induced sleep of the wounded. Ahead of her, Colonel Greer was waiting. She kept walking, her shadow stretching long and thin across the dirt. Colonel Warren Greer was not the man Tessa had constructed in her mind during her walk. She had imagined someone hard-edged and angular, a man who wore his authority like a suit of jagged armor, constantly reminding those around him of the vast distance between their ranks. She expected a coldness, a rigid adherence to the hierarchy that would make the air in the room feel thin and oppressive. What she found when she stepped into the command vehicle at 1947 was far more dangerous. Greer was warm. He was 61 years old, with a shock of silver hair that caught the light of the overhead leads, and a face that had likely been handsome in a rugged, classic way decades ago. Time had settled into the lines of his face, making him look distinguished rather than old. He was sitting at a small field table, 2 cups of coffee already poured and steaming. When Tessa entered, he did something she didn't expect. He stood up. He offered her the easy, practiced courtesy of a man hosting a dinner party rather than a commander conducting damage control after a catastrophic failure. He called her by her rank and invited her to sit down. Tessa sat, but she didn't touch the coffee. She watched the steam rise in thin, elegant ribbons, a sharp contrast to the grit and violence she had lived through hours before. Greer noticed her hesitation. A flicker of something, not offense but a quick mental recalibration, crossed his features. He settled back into his own chair, folding his hands on the table with a grace that felt entirely too polished for a combat zone. He looked at her with an expression of genuine, practiced concern. He told her he wanted to speak with her personally, before the formal review process took over. He said he found that conversations were almost always better before they became proceedings, before they became adversarial. He paused, his gaze softening. He asked how she was doing physically. Tessa's voice was steady when she replied. She told him she was fine, that her arm had been dressed and the wound wasn't serious. Greer nodded slowly, his expression one of paternal approval. He told her that what she did today was remarkable. He said he meant it sincerely. He mentioned that the after-action reports were already coming in and they painted a picture of someone operating under extraordinary pressure with exceptional skill. He met her eyes and told her she had saved lives today, a great many lives. Tessa waited. She didn't offer a thank you, she didn't break the silence. She watched him pick up his coffee, take a measured sip, and set it back down with a quiet clink. He told her he wanted to be honest with her because she deserved honesty and because he believed she was smart enough to see through anything else. He paused again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then he dropped the bombshell. He admitted that the decision to hold the Quick Reaction Force, the QRF, had been his. He said he made it based on incomplete information and under significant time pressure. He admitted with a tone of heavy, sorrowful regret that he had made the wrong call. His voice carried exactly the right amount of weight. It wasn't quite contrition, but it wasn't quite an excuse either. It was something expertly calibrated in between. He told her that his mistake would be part of the formal record and that he accepted full responsibility. Tessa kept her face a mask of professional neutrality. She had spent 4 years in intelligence work, training herself to keep her expressions still while her mind processed and categorized information at high speed. She used every bit of that training now. She realized Greer was getting ahead of the story. He was framing the QRF decision as a genuine, acknowledged mistake made by a good man under impossible pressure. He was trying to claim the narrative before anyone else could frame it as negligence, or worse, as something deliberate. A man who admits to a mistake controls the perimeter of that mistake. A man who is caught hiding one is defenseless. "I appreciate your honesty, sir," she said, her voice a flat line. Greer continued, his voice shifting slightly, becoming more precise, more careful. He moved to the heart of the matter, her formal statement. He noted that the review process would ask her about the events in the canyon, about her actions, and specifically about what she heard on the command net. He looked at her directly, his eyes searching hers for a sign of weakness. He said he wanted to make sure her statement was complete and accurate, including the context in which decisions were made. There it was, context. That was the word he was using to build his fortress. Context was the tool used to make a catastrophic decision sound like a reasonable one. Context was the explanation for why information was limited, why the situation was ambiguous, and why the pressure was extreme. It was the way you turned a command to let them hold into a judgment call made in good faith. Tessa told him she intended to be completely accurate. "Good," Greer said, leaning forward slightly. He argued that accuracy required understanding the full picture. He explained that at the time he made the QRF decision, the threat assessment he had received indicated only a limited engagement. He claimed the initial reports from the convoy were confused and contradictory. He said he was operating on a 15-minute-old intelligence picture that suggested a probe rather than a full-scale ambush. He admitted that didn't change the outcome, but insisted it was part of the record. "It is, sir," Tessa replied. She felt a cold clarity settle over her. She added that the record would also include the formal request Chief Pierce had submitted for a terrain assessment before the convoy entered the Narrows. It would include the warning she had personally given Sergeant Holloway about the ridgeline 40 minutes before the first shot was fired. And she added, it would include the exact timestamp of the first RPG impact versus the timestamp of the decision to hold the QRF. She kept her voice completely even, devoid of accusation, stating the facts as if she were reading a weather report. The room went profoundly quiet. The hum of the generator outside seemed to fade, leaving a vacuum of silence in the command vehicle. Greer's hands, still folded on the table, didn't move a millimeter, but something behind his eyes did. It was a recalculation, a sudden, sharp realization that the woman sitting across from him was not going to be managed. The warmth didn't disappear, he was far too skilled for that, but it became slightly more deliberate, a performance that was now visible to both of them. He remarked that she was thorough. Tessa replied that it was her job, she was an intelligence analyst. Greer looked at her for a long moment, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. Then he decided to be direct. He told her that what happened in the next 72 hours would shape the rest of both of their careers. He said the review would determine the official record of the day's actions, and that record would determine how history understood what happened in that canyon. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost intimate level. He told her she was a talented officer with an exceptional future, a future the intelligence community desperately needed. He said he would hate to see that future complicated by a review process that became adversarial, drawn out, and damaging to everyone involved. "Is that a threat, sir?" Tessa asked. The question was simple, direct, and devoid of heat. Greer didn't blink. He called it an observation. It sounded like a threat to Tessa. For the first time, she saw Greer's composure crack. It wasn't a total collapse, just a fractional tightening around his eyes, and a breath held a second too long. Tessa was trained to read micro-expressions, the tiny, involuntary tells of the human face, and she caught it clearly. He insisted he was trying to help her. Tessa stood up. She kept her voice level, professional, the voice of someone who had already crossed the Rubicon and had no intention of looking back. She looked him in the eye and told him that he had 620 Marines in a kill box and he had closed the radio channel. She told him she was on that net. She had heard his voice. She had heard the decision. And she said she was going to put all of it into her formal statement, completely, accurately, with every timestamp she could reconstruct and every witness who was within earshot. She thanked him for the coffee and walked out of the command vehicle. Outside, the night air hit her with a sudden, refreshing coldness. It felt clean after the manufactured warmth of the vehicle. She stood there for a moment, the silence of the camp wrapping around her, and waited for the fear to arrive. She knew she should be afraid. She had just challenged a man who had spent decades mastering the levers of military power. She had likely just ended her career before it had truly begun. The fear came, a cold shiver down her spine, but she acknowledged it and then set it aside. She walked back toward the medical area, partly because she had told Ruiz she'd be there, and partly because she needed to be near someone like James Eastwick, someone whose life was a testament to her choices, rather than a threat to her future. She found Ruiz halfway there. He was walking toward her, his silhouette bulky against the dim lights of the camp. He noted that she was back quickly. She told him it hadn't taken long. When he asked how it went, she summarized it briefly. Greer had tried to frame his decision as a mistake made in good faith and then subtly suggested her career might suffer if she didn't play along. Ruiz stopped walking, his body tensing. He asked if Greer had threatened her. Tessa used Greer's own word. He'd made an observation. She told Ruiz she had informed the colonel that she was putting everything in her statement. Ruiz stood very still. Then he asked what she needed from him right now. Tessa told him she needed him to remember everything he heard on the command net, every word, every timestamp. Ruiz reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He told her he was already on it, that he'd been writing it down since they'd cleared the canyon. Tessa took the paper, unfolding it in the shadows. What she saw made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a sober, heavy sense of gratitude. Ruiz had recorded everything: the sequence, the estimated times, the names of other Marines who had been close enough to the radio to hear. She told him it was good. He replied that he wasn't just a gunner. She folded his notes and tucked them into her jacket alongside Greer's message. They were two pieces of a larger puzzle, a record she was going to build with the same meticulous care she used for every intelligence assessment. At 21:30, Pierce found her. He didn't mention the meeting with Greer, which told her he already knew about it. He had eyes and ears everywhere. They sat together on a wooden bench outside the medical tent, a small, unexpected piece of furniture that felt like a luxury. For a few minutes, they just sat in the dark, listening to the generator's rhythm and the occasional shout of a Marine across the camp. Pierce broke the silence. He told her Greer had called the Judge Advocate General's office, JAG, 20 minutes ago. He was getting ahead of the review, filing his own account before anyone else could speak. Pierce asked how much time she needed to write her statement. Tessa said she could have a draft in 2 hours. Pierce told her she had one. The review board was convening at 06:00, and all formal statements were due by 05:00. He offered to find someone to type it for her, but she insisted her arm was fine. Pierce gave her a look that almost resembled a smile and walked away. Tessa pulled out her notepad and pen. There, on the bench outside the medical tent, with the smell of the mountains and diesel in the air, she began to write. She wrote for an hour and 40 minutes without stopping. She wrote about the eerie silence on the ridge that morning, the weight of the premonition she'd had. She wrote about Sergeant Holloway's dismissal of her concerns. She wrote about the first RPG impact, the way the sound had swallowed the world, and the calculated arithmetic she'd done to identify the enemy positions. She wrote about the command net, Greer's voice, the specific words he used, and the chilling silence after he'd cut the channel. She wrote about the 11 positions she'd neutralized, about Eastwick, and about being the last one out of the canyon. At 23:15, she handed the finished statement to a young Marine runner who took it with a solemnity that suggested he knew the weight of what he was carrying. She watched him disappear toward the command tent, then leaned back and looked at the stars. They were brilliant and cold, the kind of sky that made everything on Earth feel small and temporary. She liked that feeling. It felt honest. A few minutes later, she heard footsteps. Lieutenant Locke sat down beside her. He looked like a man who had been at war with his own conscience for hours. He told her he wanted to say something. He admitted that during the debrief with Major Hale, he had been there to provide command context, and he hadn't spoken up in her defense when Hale was attacking her. He looked at the ground and said he should have. Tessa waited, letting the silence do the work. Locke continued, saying he was saying it now. He told her he had submitted his own statement to the board, documenting the warning she'd given about the ridgeline. He also documented that he had reviewed her threat assessment 2 days before the convoy moved and had rated it as credible. He admitted that the assessment hadn't changed the route or the timing because no one had acted on it. He'd flagged it, sent it to Hale's planning section, and it had simply been filed away. The weight of that revelation settled over Tessa. She realized this wasn't just about a single bad decision on a radio, it was a systemic failure. Locke stood up, told her to get some sleep, and walked away. Tessa sat there, holding the new shape of the day in her mind. Someone had known. The threat had been documented and ignored. The thought she'd had in the canyon that they had been expected took on a darker, more concrete meaning. Just after midnight, Pierce returned. His voice was different now, not urgent because Pierce didn't do urgency but stripped of his usual calm. He told her there was something she needed to know. He had heard from the JAG officer Greer had called. They had served together years ago. Greer's statement didn't just frame the QRF decision as a mistake. It included a section on Tessa's actions. Specifically, Greer was suggesting that her unauthorized weapons employment had escalated the engagement. He was arguing that the ambush might have been intended as a limited probe, and that Tessa's shooting had provoked a more sustained and deadly enemy response. Tessa felt a surge of cold, clean fury. He was saying she made it worse. Pierce explained that it was a calculated move. Greer didn't need to prove it. He just needed to create enough doubt to turn the review into a debate about competing accounts rather than a clear-cut case of command negligence. Doubt was his shield. He needed the story to be complicated because the simple story, that he had abandoned his men and she had saved them, was fatal to him. Tessa stood up, her body rigid. She refused to pace. She needed to remain vertical to push back against the gravity of the lie. She asked how he could possibly argue that in the face of 11 dead enemy positions. Pierce told her Greer would argue that in the chaos of the canyon, no one could truly know the causal chain of events. Most of the witnesses were pinned down and couldn't see the whole picture. Greer would use the fog of war as his cover. She looked at Pierce, reminding him that they had the list, the timestamps, and the witness accounts. Pierce agreed that those were the anchors, but they needed people to stand behind them. They needed voices to tell the board exactly what they had seen. A sniper systematically dismantling an ambush that would have killed everyone. He listed the names, himself, Locke, Kowalski, Ruiz, and Eastwick if possible, and her. He told her she was the one with the clearest picture. Her testimony wasn't just about defending herself. It was about establishing the undeniable sequence of reality. He met her eyes and asked if she could do it. Tessa thought about standing before the board, recounting the moments she had taken lives to save lives, while the man who had tried to let them die sat in judgment. She thought about Greer's warm voice and his folded, clean hands. She didn't hesitate. She told him she could. The rest of the night was a blur of preparation. The camp never truly slept, but the character of the noise changed. The heavy machinery slowed, replaced by the quiet murmurs of men preparing for the dawn. Tessa didn't sleep. She spent the remaining hours reviewing her notes, mentally walking back through every second of the ambush. She visualized the ridgeline, the muzzle flashes, the way the wind had caught her hair just before she pulled the trigger. She needed the memories to be sharp, indestructible. At 04:30, the sky began to lighten, a pale, sickly gray creeping over the eastern peaks. The cold intensified, the kind of deep, biting chill that preceded the sun. Tessa washed her face with cold water from a canteen, the shock of it clearing the last of the mental fog. She checked her uniform, smoothing the fabric and ensuring her rank insignia was straight. She looked at her reflection in a small, cracked mirror hanging near the medical tent. She looked older than she had 24 hours ago, the lines around her eyes more pronounced, her expression harder. She met Ruiz and Kowalski near the command center at 05:45. Ruiz looked like he hadn't slept either, his eyes bloodshot but his posture as steady as a rock. Kowalski was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual bravado replaced by a somber, focused energy. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. They were soldiers entering a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were words and the terrain was a formal record. The review was held in a large, double-wide tent that had been cleared of most of its equipment. A long table had been set up at one end, behind which sat 3 high-ranking officers Tessa didn't recognize. A colonel from a different regiment, a lieutenant colonel, and a major. They looked tired but professional, their faces unreadable. Greer was already there, seated at a separate table to the side. He looked impeccable, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression one of solemn, cooperative gravity. He didn't look at Tessa when she entered. The proceedings began with a clinical efficiency. The initial reports were read, the dry language of military bureaucracy stripping the terror and the blood from the events. Maps were displayed, showing the kill zone and the projected enemy positions. Then the witnesses were called. Pierce went first. He spoke with a calm, authoritative precision that seemed to fill the tent. He described the tactical situation with the clarity of a master, detailing how the ambush had been structured and why the convoy had been uniquely vulnerable. He didn't use hyperbole, he didn't need to. He simply laid out the facts of the ground. When asked about Tessa's role, he was unequivocal. He stated that her actions were the only reason the battalion hadn't been wiped out. He described her fire as disciplined, targeted, and essential. Then came the questions about the QRF. The atmosphere in the tent shifted, the tension ratcheting up. Pierce recounted the radio calls, the requests for support, and the final, crushing command to let them hold. He didn't look at Greer as he spoke, but the colonel's presence was a palpable weight in the room. Locke was called next. He looked nervous but spoke with a surprising firmness. He admitted to the board that the threat had been identified days in advance and that his recommendations had been ignored. He saw the officers at the head table exchange a look, a brief, sharp moment of concern. This was the first crack in the official narrative. It wasn't just a mistake in the heat of the moment. It was a failure of planning and leadership that preceded the first shot. Ruiz's testimony was raw and visceral. He talked about the sound of the rounds hitting the vehicles, the smell of the burning oil, and the sight of Tessa on the ridge. He spoke about the radio, too, confirming the words they had all heard. By the time he was finished, the simple story Greer had tried to tell was beginning to fray at the edges. Finally, it was Tessa's turn. She walked to the center of the room and stood before the board. She felt every eye on her, the officers, the JAG representatives, and Greer. She took a breath, the air cold in her lungs, and began to speak. She didn't talk about her feelings, she talked about the data. She described the terrain, the angles of fire, and the specific threats she had neutralized. She provided the timestamps, matching them to the events on the ground with a terrifying accuracy. When the major on the board asked her about Greer's suggestion that her shooting had escalated the engagement, Tessa didn't flinch. She looked the major in the eye and explained the tactical reality of the canyon. She explained that the enemy had already committed to a full-scale ambush, that the first RPG impact was the signal for total engagement. She argued that the idea of a limited probe was inconsistent with the placement of 11 reinforced firing positions. She spoke with the authority of the person who had been the only one seeing the whole picture. She then addressed the command net. She repeated Greer's words, the exact phrasing, and the exact time they were spoken. She described the silence that followed, the 30-minute window where they were left to die. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. As she spoke, she finally allowed herself to look at Greer. He was no longer the warm, fatherly figure from the night before. His face was pale, his jaw set in a hard, tight line. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the man beneath, the man who was willing to sacrifice his soldiers to protect his reputation, and then sacrifice one more to cover his tracks. The review lasted for hours. The questioning was grueling, designed to find inconsistencies, to shake the witnesses, to find the context Greer so desperately wanted. But the anchors held. The facts were too many and the voices were too consistent. The record was being built word by word, and it was a record that Greer couldn't control. When Tessa finally walked out of the tent, the sun was high in the sky, washing the valley in a bright, unforgiving light. She felt drained, her body trembling with the aftereffects of the adrenaline and the exhaustion. But there was a new feeling, too, a sense of completion. She had done what she set out to do. She had told the truth, formally and on the record. Pierce was waiting for her outside. He didn't say anything at first, just handed her a bottle of water. She took a long drink, the water cool and sweet. He looked at the tent, then back at her. He noted that the board would take time to deliberate, but the momentum had shifted. The truth was out, and it was a stubborn thing. Tessa looked out over the camp. She saw Ruiz and Kowalski talking near the motor pool. She saw the helicopters taking off, heading back into the mountains. The war was still going on, the machinery of conflict still turning. But for one day, in one canyon, and in one tent, the narrative had been reclaimed. She thought about the rest of her career, about the complications Greer had threatened. She realized she didn't care. She had walked into that canyon as an analyst, but she had come out as something else. She had learned that authority was not the same as leadership, and that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal was the truth. She began to walk toward the medical tent to check on Eastwick. She walked with the same deliberate, unhurried pace she had learned from Pierce. She knew where she was going now. The road ahead might be difficult, and the fight might not be over, but she was no longer walking in the dark. She was walking in the light of what had happened, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she truly belonged. The way he had said it sounded more like a simple observation of fact rather than a calculated threat. It was a cold, clinical assessment of reality, delivered with the gravity of a man who had seen too many realities shattered by the stroke of a pen. Tessa sat there, the weight of the silence pressing in on her as she thought about those 11 positions on the ridge. She thought about the heat radiating off the canyon walls and the way the dust had tasted like copper and old bone. She thought about the 11 muzzle flashes that had been systematically extinguished and the way those 11 ghosts were now pushing north, invisible but heavy, right into James Eastwick's face. "Yes," she finally said, her voice sounding small in the vast expanse of the desert night. It was a good observation. Pierce nodded slowly, a movement so subtle it was almost lost in the shadows. He stood up then, his joints popping with a sound like dry kindling. He looked toward the horizon, where the darkness was absolute and the mountains were merely a jagged absence of stars. He told her that 0500 was only 4 hours away. The statement she had submitted was solid, he said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet authority. He told her not to change a single word of it. "I won't," she promised, and she meant it. The truth was the only thing she had left that hadn't been battered by the events of the previous day. And then he did something he hadn't done once since the sun rose. He called her Tessa. Not petty officer, not Calder, not analyst. Just Tessa. She looked up at him, her eyes stinging from the lack of sleep and the lingering grit of the canyon. He met her gaze with a steadiness that felt like an anchor. He told her that what she did in that canyon was real. It happened. No matter what a review board decided, no matter what a JAG filing claimed, and no matter how carefully a colonel worded a statement to protect his own career, 620 people were breathing right now because of the decisions she had made in real time, under real fire. "Don't let anyone make you doubt what was real," he added, and then he turned and walked away into the gloom. Tessa watched him go until his silhouette merged with the dark shapes of the tents and the parked Humvees. She sat back down on the wooden bench, her movements slow and deliberate. She tucked her notepad into her jacket pocket, feeling the crinkle of the paper against her ribs. Above her, the stars were the same stars she had seen 1,000 times before. They were honest in their distance, indifferent to the petty dramas of men on the ground, and they were still there. 4 hours. She knew she should sleep. Her body was screaming for it, a dull ache vibrating in her marrow. 0600 was going to require everything she had left, and she had already spent the vast majority of her reserves 12 hours ago. She had spent them in a canyon where the air was thick with the smell of burnt propellant and the screams of men who didn't want to die. She had spent them calculating windage and elevation on a scratched ballistic window while the world exploded around her. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, the canyon did. It didn't come back all at once, and it didn't come in a linear sequence. It came in flashes, like a strobe light in a dark room. She saw the first shot, the way it broke the unnatural stillness that had preceded the ambush. She remembered the math, the cold, beautiful, terrifying math of distance and wind. She played back the moment she had looked at the North Ridge and felt that sudden, sharp clarity. It wasn't a calculation anymore. It was an understanding. It was the moment she knew the shot was possible. She replayed those seconds over and over, sharpening the memories until they were solid and undeniable. She needed them to be undeniable because, in a few hours, people who weren't there were going to try to tell her that what she saw wasn't what she saw. At 0300, the darkness was interrupted by the soft crunch of boots on gravel. Ruiz appeared out of the shadows, looking like a ghost in his dusty fatigues. He was carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee that he must have scavenged from the mess tent or some hidden corner of the base. He sat down next to her without saying a word and handed her one of the cups. The heat seeped through the thin plastic, warming her numb fingers. They sat there in the dark, the only sound the distant hum of a generator and the occasional rustle of the wind against the canvas tents. Neither of them spoke. Some moments are too heavy for words, too fragile to be poked at with conversation. This was one of them. They were 2 people who had survived a meat grinder, and the simple act of sitting together in the silence was enough. The coffee was bitter and scorched, but it was the best thing Tessa had ever tasted. It tasted like being alive. The minutes ticked by, measured in the cooling of the coffee and the slow rotation of the stars. At 0445, the sky began to bleed into a bruised shade of purple. Tessa stood up. She straightened her jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles as best she could. She reached into her pocket and felt the edges of her statement, ensuring it was still there, a paper shield against whatever was coming next. She turned toward the command tent. Even from a distance, she could see the glow of lanterns inside. The review board was already assembling. Ruiz stood up with her, his face weary but set in a grim mask of determination. He asked if she was ready. She looked at the command tent, then back at him, and admitted that she wasn't. "Me neither," he said, a ghost of a tired smile touching his lips. "Let's go anyway." They walked together toward the light, their boots rhythmic on the hard-packed earth. The review board convened at 0600 exactly. The punctuality was a message in itself. Boards that start on time are boards that intend to finish on time, and boards that intend to finish on time have usually already reached their conclusions long before the first witness is even called. The command tent had been transformed overnight. The field planning maps and the cluttered desks had been swept away, replaced by a configuration that mimicked a formal courtroom. 3 officers sat behind a long, heavy table that looked like it had been salvaged from a more permanent installation. In the center was Brigadier General Harwick, a man Tessa didn't know, with a face like weathered granite and eyes that seemed to see through walls. To his right sat Colonel Reyes from the Judge Advocate General's office. Reyes had the peculiar, unsettling stillness of a predator or a professional poker player, someone trained to give absolutely nothing away through body language or expression. To Harwick's left was Lieutenant Colonel Marsh from the Inspector General's office. Marsh was already busy, his head down as he took notes by hand with a focused intensity. He seemed to understand that in the military, what gets written down is what survives, and everything else is just vapor. Colonel Greer was not at the main table. He was seated to the left, in a chair that was technically within the circle of the proceedings but removed from the seat of authority. He was dressed in his full dress uniform, a sharp contrast to the field gear everyone else was wearing. Tessa registered the choice immediately. Full dress in a forward operating base was a performance. It was a calculated reminder of 30 years of service, of rank, and of institutional weight. It was a suit of armor made of metals and ribbons, designed to intimidate before a single word was spoken. Tessa was still in her field uniform. It was the only thing she had that wasn't shredded or covered in someone else's blood. She sat down in the witness chair, an actual wooden chair, not a folding stool, and placed her hands flat on her knees. She didn't look at Greer. Instead, she fixed her gaze on General Harwick and waited. "This board is convened at 0600, June 14th, Harwick announced, his voice dry and as precise as a metronome. He spoke for the record, his words being captured by Marsh's flying pen. He stated the purpose of the board, to review the events of the preceding day involving the 1st Battalion convoy operations and to assess the actions of specific personnel. Then he looked directly at her. "Petty Officer First Class Tessa Calder," he said, "you are here as both a subject of review and a material witness. Do you understand the distinction?" "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady. Harwick explained the dual nature of the hearing. As a subject, they were examining whether her actions were within the bounds of her role and the rules of engagement. As a witness, they needed her account of the facts. He asked if she had any objection to the 2 tracks being handled in the same session. She told him she didn't. "Good," he said. "Let's begin." What followed was a masterclass in systematic interrogation. Tessa had been trained in intelligence, and she recognized the methodology immediately. It wasn't hostile, and it wasn't friendly. It was a brick-by-brick construction of a timeline. Harwick and his team asked the same questions from different angles, triangulating the truth like a radio signal. They wanted to know about the silence on the ridge, the missing bird song, the specific words she had exchanged with Ruiz before the first explosion. She described the morning in detail. She told them about the scratched ballistic window and why she had been looking through it. She described the warning she had given to Holloway and the dismissive response she had received. She was building the scene for them, trying to make them feel the tension that had been thick enough to choke on. Colonel Reyes interrupted her then. He wanted to know exactly when she had retrieved her weapon. Was it before or after the first RPG impact? She told him she was already moving toward the door when the impact occurred. So it was simultaneous with the attack? Reyes asked, his voice neutral. "Yes, sir," she said. "And was there an order?" "No, sir," she replied. "There was no order." Reyes made a long note on his pad. "No order was issued subsequently authorizing your weapon's employment?" He pushed. "No, sir," she said. "No order was possible. The command net was in full chaos within 30 seconds. I made an independent tactical decision based on my assessment of the immediate threat." Reyes leaned forward slightly. "You are an intelligence analyst," he said, his voice cold. "You are not a designated marksman. You are not a sniper. You are not a combat arms specialist. On what basis did you determine that your independent tactical decision was appropriate?" This was the moment she had been waiting for since 1 in the morning. This was the eye of the storm. She looked at Reyes, then at Harwick, and then she let her gaze drift toward the back of the tent where the shadows were deepest. She told them the truth. She did it because people were dying and she was the only one who could stop it. The tent went deathly silent. Even Marsh's pen stopped its frantic scratching for a heartbeat. "That is not a protocol," Reyes said, his voice flat. "No, sir, it isn't," Tessa countered. "Protocols assume a functioning command structure with the capacity to respond." In the first 3 minutes, that structure did not exist. The convoy was in a full envelope ambush. No exit route, no support, no air cover. The Marines in those lead vehicles had minutes to live. I had the capability to change that outcome. I used it. She kept her voice level, stripped of emotion. She knew that emotion would be seen as a weakness, a sign that she had been overwhelmed by the moment. She needed to be as factual as a topography map. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Greer shift in his chair. It was a tiny movement, just a subtle adjustment of his posture, but she caught it. Harwick spoke up then, shifting the focus. "Let's talk about the QRF," he said. He mentioned the timestamp, 11:17, when Chief Pierce had requested the quick reaction force. He asked her what she had heard on the command net. This was the second pillar of the day, the one that carried even more weight than her own actions. She recounted every word she could remember, providing the timestamps she had calculated against the attack timeline. She told them about Pierce's formal request. She told them about the static on the channel, and then she told them about the voice that had broken through the chaos. She quoted the words exactly, "Pull the QRF. We are not sending reinforcements. Let them hold." She said the words without inflection. She didn't need to add editorial commentary. The words were damning enough on their own. Greer shifted again, more noticeably this time. Reyes stared at her, his eyes narrowed. "You are certain it was Colonel Greer's voice?" he asked. "I am certain," she said. "I am trained in signals intelligence and voice identification. I have heard the colonel speak every day for a week. The quality was degraded by field conditions, but there was no mistake. It was his voice." Reyes wrote something down, the pen pressing hard enough to tear the paper. Harwick looked at the other board members and announced a 15-minute recess. They all stood and filed out of the tent, leaving Tessa sitting in the witness chair. She didn't move. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her pace or rub her eyes. She sat with her hands on her knees and breathed slowly, staring at the empty chairs behind the table. She could feel Greer's presence, even though he was several feet away. He was watching her, she knew, but she refused to look back. At 07:12, the board reconvened. Harwick's expression had changed. It was grimmer now, more focused. He announced that the board had received additional testimony that had been submitted prior to the start of the hearing. There were statements from Lieutenant Lockatch, Chief Pierce, Sergeant Kowalski, and Corporal Ruiz. But the most significant piece of evidence was a written assessment dated 3 days prior to the engagement. It had been submitted by Lieutenant Lockatch, and it recommended a complete route modification to avoid the canyon narrows based on a credible threat assessment. Tessa felt a jolt of adrenaline, but she kept her face a mask of stone. Harwick turned his attention to Greer. "Colonel," he said, "the board would like to ask you about this assessment." Greer stood up, smoothing his dress jacket with a practiced hand. He looked composed, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. He claimed he hadn't been the recipient of the assessment. He said his planning section had received it, and he couldn't confirm if it had ever reached his desk before the convoy moved. He was trying to hide behind the bureaucracy, trying to turn a failure of command into a clerical error. "So you didn't see it?" Harwick pressed. "I cannot confirm that I saw it, no, sir," Greer replied. Harwick's voice was like a knife. It recommended avoiding the narrows. The convoy went through the narrows anyway, and you, as the brigade commander, approved the route. Greer hesitated. It was only a second, a tiny fracture in his composure, but in a room like this, a second was an eternity. He said the road had been established in the planning phase and that his approval was for the operation as a whole, not for each individual segment. He was trying to distance himself from the decision, trying to push the responsibility down the chain of command. Harwick looked at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he looked at Marsh, who was riding faster than ever. "Sit down, Colonel," Harwick said. Tessa let out a slow, silent breath through her nose. The room had shifted. The air felt different. Chief Pierce was called next. He walked into the tent with the deliberate, unhurried gait of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. He sat in the chair and looked at the board members with the ease of someone who had seen much worse things than a room full of officers. Harwick asked him about the document he had submitted, the one listing the 11 neutralized positions. Pierce explained how he had assembled it, cross-referencing accounts from vehicle commanders and physical evidence on the ground. He called it an accurate reconstruction of the engagement. 11 positions, Harwick repeated as if trying to grasp the scale of it. 11 confirmed, Pierce said, all attributed to Petty Officer Calder. She acted alone without orders for 47 minutes. She managed her own movement, and in the end, she carried a wounded Marine to safety. Reyes asked for Pierce's professional assessment. Did her actions help or harm the convoy? Pierce looked at him like he had just been asked if the sun was hot. Without her, the convoy doesn't exit that canyon, he said. The lead vehicles were dead in the water. We had no support, and we were running out of bullets. She broke the ambush. That's not an assessment, sir. That's a fact. When Pierce left the tent, he didn't look at Tessa, but he didn't have to. The truth was now part of the record. Ruiz followed him, and the contrast was stark. Ruiz was 22, nervous, and clearly out of his element. He sat on the edge of the chair, his eyes darting between the officers. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. He confirmed the timestamps. He confirmed the sequence of events. And then he dropped the final piece of the puzzle. He had written down Greer's words on the radio the moment they had cleared the canyon. He produced his handwritten notes, and Marsh took them, filing them into the record with a grim nod. At 0840, Greer was called back. The atmosphere in the tent was now openly hostile toward him. Harwick wasn't asking procedural questions anymore. He was hunting. He asked Greer about his JAG filing, the one that suggested Tessa's actions might have escalated the situation. He asked for the basis of that assessment. Greer tried to pivot. He said it was a possibility he wanted the board to consider, not a conclusion. But Harwick wouldn't let him go. He pointed out that Pierce's documentation showed the ambush was already fully engaged before Tessa fired a single shot. He listed the facts: 11 positions neutralized, 620 lives saved, a QRF that was never sent, and a threat assessment that was ignored. The board will draw its own conclusions, Harwick said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. What I am asking you, Colonel, is whether your filing was an accurate representation of your professional judgment, or if it was submitted for another purpose. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Greer looked at the general, his face pale. It was my professional assessment, he said, but the words sounded hollow. Harwick didn't reply. He simply announced that the board would recess for deliberation and that all parties were to remain on site. Tessa walked out of the tent and into the bright, harsh light of the morning. The sun was high now, bleaching the color out of the landscape. She stood there and let the warmth hit her face, feeling the staggering weight of exhaustion finally beginning to take hold. Pierce was waiting outside. They stood together in the dirt, looking at nothing in particular. Then Lockhatch joined them, a grim look of satisfaction on his face. He talked about the route assessment document and the look on Harwick's face when it was read into the record. It was no longer a matter of a judgment call made under pressure. It was documented negligence. Greer couldn't hide behind the fog of war anymore. At 10:17, the call went out for them to return. The tent felt even smaller now, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and tension. Harwick read the findings in a flat, official voice that stripped away the drama but left the bones of the story bare. The findings were a surgical strike. The board found that Tessa had operated outside her role, but that the circumstances, the lack of command, the immediate threat, and her own capability constituted a valid basis for her actions. She had acted under the principle of immediate response to an imminent threat. There would be no disciplinary action. Then came the hammer. The board found that the decision to withhold the QRF warranted further review. They found that the ignored route assessment was a matter of serious concern. Both issues were being referred to the Inspector General for a follow-on investigation. Harwick set the papers down and looked at Tessa. He told her the finding was a formal acknowledgement of what had happened. He said it wasn't a commendation, but he wanted her to know that what she did mattered. The board sees that clearly, he added. "Thank you, sir," she said. She stood up, turned, and walked out. Outside, Ruiz was waiting on a rock near the motor pool. He had 2 more cups of coffee. He handed her one and asked how it went. "No disciplinary finding," she told him, "and Greer is headed for the IG." Ruiz took a long, slow breath, exhaling the tension he'd been holding since before dawn. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she agreed, "it's not nothing." They sat there and watched the camp move around them. The daily rhythm of the military was reasserting itself. Trucks were being loaded, gear was being checked, and somewhere someone was complaining about the heat. Life was going on. Pierce walked past them, giving Tessa a single, sharp nod, the only recognition he ever gave, and the only one she ever needed. Tessa looked at the mountains. Yesterday they had been a death trap. Today they were just rock and shadows. She thought about the 11 positions and the boy from Ohio who was probably dreaming of cornfields right now. She thought about the weight of the decisions she had made, a weight she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. It wouldn't go away, but it didn't have to crush her. She was still standing. The coffee was hot. The record existed. At 11:30, a runner arrived with a message from the medevac area. James Eastwick was being moved. He was going home, and he wanted to know the name of the person who had carried him out of the canyon. Tessa read the note twice, then handed it to Ruiz and started walking toward the medical tents. When she walked in, the first thing she saw was Eastwick sitting up. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory. His legs were heavily bandaged, but he was alive. He was sitting up, which meant he was fighting. She felt something in her chest finally loosen, a knot she hadn't realized was there. The air in the medical tent was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the low, constant hum of portable cooling units. It was a sterile, temporary sanctuary, a halfway point between the violence of the canyon and the long road of recovery that lay ahead. James Eastwick looked younger than he had in the dust of the ambush. Without the grime and the terror masking his features, he was just a kid, his face pale against the drab green of the cot's linens. When his eyes met hers, there was a flicker of recognition, a spark of something that transcended the rank on her sleeves. "You're the one," he said, his voice raspy and thin. Tessa walked to the side of his bed, her boots quiet on the reinforced flooring. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a person who had done a job that shouldn't have been necessary. "I'm Tessa," she said simply. He looked at her for a long time, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the figure who had dragged him through a storm of lead and fire. "Ohio," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. "You mentioned Ohio." "I did," she said. "I told you that you were going back there. I don't like being wrong." He let out a weak, shaking breath that might have been a laugh if he'd had the strength for it. "The medics told me my legs are going to be okay." "Long road," they said, "but okay." Tessa nodded. She felt a profound sense of relief, a quiet settling of the soul. The mathematical certainty of her shots had saved the convoy, but the sight of this one boy sitting up, talking about his future, this was the real math. This was the only equation that truly mattered. She stayed with him for a few minutes, listening as he talked about his family and the small town he'd left behind. He talked about things that were normal and boring and beautiful. When the transport team arrived to move him to the airfield, Tessa stepped back. She watched as they carefully transferred him to a litter, their movements practiced and efficient. As they began to wheel him out, Eastwick reached out a hand, grasping hers for a fleeting second. "Thank you," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. Tessa watched the ambulance pull away, the dust kicking up in its wake. She stood at the edge of the staging area for a long time, the sun beating down on her shoulders. The board's findings were important. The legalities and the IG investigations were necessary, and the downfall of men like Greer was perhaps inevitable. But as she turned back toward her own tent, she realized that the weight she carried wasn't a burden of guilt or trauma. It was a weight of responsibility, a permanent reminder that in the moments when the world falls apart, the only thing that holds it together is the choice to act. She walked past the command tent, where the lanterns had been extinguished and the officers had dispersed. The silence there was different now, no longer the silence of a looming threat, but the silence of a closed chapter. She found Ruiz back at their spot, though he had traded the coffee for a canteen of water. He looked at her as she approached, seeing the change in her expression. "He's on his way," she said, sitting down beside him. Ruiz nodded, taking a slow sip of water. "Good, he deserved a win. We all did." They sat there together as the afternoon heat began to settle over the camp. The mountains remained on the horizon, ancient and unmoving, indifferent to the shifting fortunes of the people at their feet. Tessa closed her eyes, and for the first time in over 48 hours, the images of the canyon didn't come rushing back. Instead, there was only the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the warmth of the sun. She wasn't forgetting and she wasn't hiding. She was simply moving forward one breath at a time into a future that she had fought to make possible. The record was written, the boy was going home, and for now, that was enough. It was more than enough. The camp continued its busy, chaotic dance of logistics and preparation, but for Tessa, the world had finally slowed down. She felt the rough texture of the rock beneath her, the slight breeze against her skin, and the quiet presence of the man beside her. She thought about the notepad in her pocket, the words she had written in the dark, and the truth she had defended in the light. It was a heavy thing to carry, this knowledge of what she was capable of. But as she sat there in the cooling shadow of the afternoon, she realized she was strong enough to bear it. The canyon was behind her, the board was over, and the stars would be back soon, honest and indifferent as ever. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and finally she slept. The air inside the medical tent was thick with the heavy, cloying scent of antiseptic, dried blood, and the stale, recycled humidity of portable air conditioning units struggling against the relentless Afghan sun. Tessa stepped through the heavy canvas flap, the sudden transition from the blinding white glare of the camp to the dim, fluorescent-lit interior momentarily disorienting her. It felt like stepping into another dimension, a quiet, wounded world that existed in parallel to the frantic machinery of the base outside. She took a breath, feeling a tightness in her chest she hadn't fully realized was there, a knot of tension that had been coiling tighter since the first RPG had slammed into the convoy. She scanned the rows of cots, her eyes finally settling on the figure at the far end. James Eastwick looked smaller than he had in the canyon. Stripped of his tactical vest, his helmet, and the frantic adrenaline of a man fighting for his life, he looked younger, too. He was 20 years old, a fact that hit Tessa with the force of a physical blow. He was just a kid from Ohio who had been thrust into the mouth of a meat grinder, and yet here he was. He saw her before she reached him. His face underwent a series of rapid, involuntary shifts, a flicker of recognition that smoothed into profound relief, followed by a specific, vulnerable expression. It was the look of someone who had been holding onto 1,000 unspoken words, waiting for the one person who could truly understand them to finally appear. "You came," he said, his voice raspy and thin, sounding like it had been scraped raw by dust and screaming. Tessa didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him, taking in the bandages, the Roman 4 lines, and the sheer fact of his presence. "I got your message," she said finally. Her own voice felt steady, though there was a hollowness behind it born of sheer exhaustion. She didn't wait for an invitation. She reached for a folding metal chair leaning against a nearby supply crate, dragged it to the side of his cot, and sat down. The screech of the metal legs against the plywood floor was the only sound in the small radius of their conversation. Yesterday, she might have waited to be asked. Today, she had stopped waiting for permission to exist in the spaces she occupied. "How are the legs both still attached?" she asked, her tone carrying a sliver of that dark, necessary humor that kept people from breaking in places like this. Eastwick managed a weak, lopsided grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, which were still shadowed by the things he'd seen. "Doc says 6 weeks, and I'll be walking without assistance," he replied, looking down at the heavy bandaging. "Maybe 3 months before I'm back to full strength." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the tent ceiling where a small fan whirred rhythmically. "Which means I missed the rest of the deployment rotation." "Yes, it does," Tessa said softly. Eastwick looked back at her, his expression turning solemn. "I'm not upset about that," he said. There was no bravado in the statement, no attempt to sound like a hardened warrior. It was the raw, uncomplicated honesty of a man who had looked directly into the abyss and realized he didn't want to go back. That honesty hit Tessa somewhere deep, in a place she wasn't prepared for. It was a level of vulnerability that rarely survived the rigid hierarchies and tough-it-out culture of the military. "That's allowed," she told him, and she meant it. "You don't owe the canyon anything else." He looked at his hands for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on the hospital blanket. Then he looked up at her, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "I asked the medics who carried me out," he said. "They didn't know who you were at first. They just called you the lady from the MRAP. Then Corporal Ruiz came by this morning and told me your name." He paused, as if weighing the weight of the name itself. "I wanted to know your name. Now you know," she said. "Tessa," he said, testing the word out, speaking it as if he were storing it somewhere permanent, a talisman against the memory of the dirt and the fire. "What do you do? I mean, what's your actual job? I saw you with the radio, but then I saw you with the rifle." "Intelligence analyst," she said. The silence that followed was heavy. Eastwick stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "You're an intel analyst." He repeated it as if the words were in a foreign language. "Yes," she replied. "Who shoots like that?" he asked, the bafflement clear in his voice. "Apparently I do," she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, matter-of-fact register. He was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly racing as he tried to bridge the gap between the image of a woman sitting behind a computer screen in a secure vault and the person who had systematically dismantled an ambush. He was trying to fit what he had witnessed into the narrow boxes the military used to define people. "My squad leader told me you took down 11 positions," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Is that true?" "That's what the documentation says," she replied, her mind flickering back to the cold, clinical clarity of the review board. "In what, 40 minutes?" he asked. 47, she corrected. Eastwick shook his head slowly. It wasn't a gesture of dismissal, it was the exact opposite. It was the headshake of someone trying to redefine their understanding of what was possible in the physical world. "I was behind the third vehicle," he said, his voice distant now, pulled back into the heat and the noise of the canyon. "We couldn't move. The guys in front of me were taking rounds from 3 directions, and there was nowhere to go. There was just the sound of metal being chewed up and the smell of fuel. And I remember thinking—" He stopped, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "I remember thinking, this is how it ends. Right here on this road. I'm going to die in the dirt and nobody's even going to know why." He looked at her and the tension that had been radiating off him began to bleed away. It was like watching someone systematically turn off a series of high-voltage switches. "That was you," he said. "You were the one who changed the ending." "That was me," she said. He nodded, the movement jerky and emotional. He looked at his hands again, and when he looked back up, his eyes were wet. He wasn't crying, not in the traditional sense, but he was in that specific state of emotional suspension where everything is hovering right at the surface. He chose to let it show. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "I said it yesterday, but I want to say it again now that I'm not half dead and I can actually mean it properly. Thank you for coming back for me. You didn't have to do that. You could have stayed in the vehicle." Tessa looked at him, and for a fleeting second, she saw the ghost of every choice she had made leading up to that moment. She thought about the tactical manuals, the rules of engagement, and the safe, predictable path of a career intel officer. She discarded 3 different versions of an answer, the professional one, the modest one, and the one that sounded like a recruiting poster. She settled on the only one that felt like the truth. "I wasn't leaving anyone in that canyon," she said. "That was never an option, not for me." He nodded, accepting the weight of her words. He wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his wrist, a sharp, self-conscious movement, the way young men do when they're embarrassed about the sudden intrusion of their own humanity. He cleared his throat, trying to find a more stable footing for the conversation. "Are you going to be okay? I heard there was a review board. Some of the guys were talking about how the brass was trying to pin the deviation on you." "There was a board," she said, her voice tightening slightly at the memory of Harwick's flat, bureaucratic tone. "It's done, and I'm still here." Eastwick almost smiled at that. It was a better almost than the one she'd seen the day before, more grounded, less haunted. "That's good," he said. "That's really good. They don't deserve to lose you." Tessa stood up, the chair scraping again. She took a moment to place it exactly where she had found it, a small, automatic courtesy her mother had drilled into her decades ago. It was a strange thing, how the habits of a peaceful childhood in a quiet suburb could persist even in the middle of a war zone. She looked at Eastwick one last time, her expression softening. "When you get home," she said, and her voice took on a weight of authority that wasn't about rank, but about experience. "Give yourself time. What happened in that canyon? It doesn't just go away because you're back in the States. It doesn't disappear because you're walking on grass instead of gravel. It stays with you for a while. That's normal. Don't try to outrun it. You won't win that race." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "Did it stay with you?" he asked. "The other times?" "Yes," she said. "Every time. Does it get easier?" She thought about the honest answer, the one that wasn't a lie of comfort. She gave it to him. "It gets different," she said. "You learn to carry it better. You learn where the sharp edges are so you don't cut yourself on them quite as often." But easier isn't exactly the right word. She paused, letting the hum of the tent fill the gap. What gets easier is knowing that carrying it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you were present. It means you were there and it mattered to you, which is the only way it should have been. If it didn't stay with you, that would be the real problem. Eastwick was quiet for a long, reflective moment. Then he whispered, "I'm going to remember that. I'm going to hold on to that." "Good," she said. "Now get some rest. You've got a long flight ahead of you tomorrow." She turned and walked away, her boots thudding softly on the plywood. As she pushed through the tent flap and back out into the harsh, unforgiving light of the late morning, she felt the full texture of the conversation settle into her bones. It was a weight, but it was a solid one, the realness of it providing a foundation that the formal findings of a review board could never touch. The board dealt in facts, in timelines, and in liability. James Eastwick dealt in something more personal and more permanent. She was glad she'd come. Corporal Ruiz was waiting outside, leaning against a stack of sandbags. It was becoming such a consistent pattern that she had stopped being surprised by his presence. He seemed to have developed a sixth sense for where she was and when she might need a friendly face. "How is he?" Ruiz asked, pushing off the sandbags. "Good," she said, squinting against the sun. "He's going to be good. He's headed home. Did it help?" Ruiz asked, his eyes searching hers. He didn't need to specify what he meant by help. He meant the closure, the human element of the aftermath. Tessa thought about it for a moment, feeling the way the knot in her chest had loosened just a fraction more. "Yeah," she said. "It helped." They started walking back toward the heart of the main camp, the dust kicking up around their boots in small, swirling clouds. "Pice is looking for you," Ruiz said after a moment. "Something about orders." Tessa stopped mid-stride. "Orders?" she repeated, a cold prickle of apprehension walking down her spine. "Already?" Ruiz shrugged, his expression unreadable. He didn't say much, just that there was something coming through official channels. He said he wanted to talk to you before you saw it cold. He's over by the comms vehicle. She changed direction without breaking her rhythm, her mind already racing through the possibilities. Was she being reassigned? Sent back to a desk in a different theater? Or was this the bureaucratic fallout Harwick had hinted at? But she found Pierce standing outside the command and control trailer. He looked the same as he always did, unflappable, stoic, a man built out of granite and seasoned by decades of quiet competence. He spent more time at the edges of the camp than in the center of it, as if he preferred the proximity to the comms towers and the incoming data over the political theater of the headquarters. He had a folded document in his hand. As she approached, he didn't offer a greeting. He simply handed it to her. She took it, the paper feeling crisp and strangely heavy in her hand. She unfolded it, and as she read the lines of cold, typed text, her world rearranged itself in the span of 30 seconds. They were temporary orders, stamped with an official seal she recognized, and signed by an authority that bypassed her immediate chain of command. Effective immediately, she was being cut from her current intelligence assignment. She was being attached on a 90-day temporary duty basis to a joint special operations task force operating out of a forward location she knew only by its reputation for high-stakes, high-risk missions. The order cited her demonstrated field capabilities and her unique intelligence synthesis background as the primary basis for the assignment. It was signed by a 2-star general she didn't know personally, but whose name carried a terrifying amount of weight in the intelligence community. At the bottom in the remarks section, someone had written 4 words by hand in black ink. She read them once, then twice, her heart thudding against her ribs. "Did you do this?" she asked, looking up at Pierce. He didn't blink. "I made a phone call," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "The people I called made a decision. Based on what they heard, they decided that leaving you in a vault in Harwick's sector was a waste of strategic assets." She looked back down at the paper. "The remarks section," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What about it?" "Read it aloud," Pierce commanded softly. She hesitated, then spoke the words. "Her country needs her." Pierce looked at her steadily, his gaze piercing. "Do you agree with that assessment?" She looked at the orders again. She thought about the review board, about Harwick's flat, colorless eyes, and the way Colonel Greer had sat with his hands folded, more concerned with the architecture of his own self-preservation than the lives of the men in the canyon. She thought about the 11 positions she had neutralized, the way the rifle had felt like an extension of her own will, and the look on Eastwick's face when he realized he wasn't going to die on that road. She thought about the 47 minutes that had rewritten her life. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining a new, harder edge. "I agree with that assessment." "Good," Pierce said. He reached out and took the orders back, folded them neatly, and handed them back to her. "You have 6 hours before the transport lifts. I'd use some of that time to sleep. You've been running on fumes since the first contact." "You keep telling me to sleep," she noted, a small, weary smile playing on her lips. "And you keep not doing it," he countered. She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a joke they'd ever shared. "Pice," she said before he could turn to go back into the comms trailer, "the phone call you made." The two-star who signed these, that wasn't just a routine personnel action. That was something else. No, it wasn't, he admitted. That was someone who knew exactly what happened in that canyon and decided it meant something beyond a single engagement. He saw the potential for a different kind of tool. How many people know? She asked. Pierce looked at her with an expression she had been cataloging all day, a mixture of deep recognition and the weight of shared secrets. More than you think, he said. Word travels fast when 600 Marines come out of a canyon that shouldn't have let them out. The people who need to know, they know. And they've been paying very close attention to how you handled the aftermath. She held that for a moment, not with pride. Pride felt too shallow for this, but with a sober understanding. She had been seen, not just her mistakes or her deviations from protocol, but the core of what she was capable of. The task force assignment, she said. What am I walking into? I don't know the specifics, Pierce said, but I know the nature of the work. It's the kind of environment where someone who can read terrain like a book, run intelligence like a grandmaster, and take a cold-bore shot at 400 meters under heavy fire is not considered a liability. You're an asset, Tessa. You've been operating below your capability for 4 years. That's over now. He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded and walked back into the trailer, leaving her standing in the dust with the orders in her hand. 6 hours. She had 6 hours of silence before her life shifted into a higher gear. She made a decision right then, one she had been moving toward since the moment she watched the silent ridge line from the back of the MRAP and felt the held breath of the valley. She was done playing small. She was done apologizing for knowing more than the people in charge. At 1300 hours, she found Ruiz. He was sitting on an upturned crate near the motor pool, cleaning his M249 SAW with a focused, methodical energy. It was a habit she recognized, using familiar, repetitive work to process the jagged edges of a traumatic experience. She sat down beside him, the heat radiating off the metal of the nearby vehicles. She didn't say anything for a while, just watched the way he handled the weapon, his hands moving with the easy grace of long practice. I got orders, she said finally. Ruiz stopped his work, a cloth draped over the barrel of the light machine gun. He looked up, his face unreadable. Where to? She told him. He was quiet for a long beat, his eyes narrowing as he processed the implications. That's not intel analyst work, he said. No, she agreed. It's not, that's blackside field work, Ruiz said, his voice dropping an octave. That's the kind of assignment people spend their entire careers trying to get and never see. I know, she said. Ruiz looked at her and something moved across his face. It was pride, though she knew he would have died before admitting it. You're going to be good at it, he said. I'm already good at it, she replied, her voice devoid of arrogance, stating it as a simple, undeniable fact. That's apparently the whole point. He almost laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound. Then he got serious again the way he did when he was actually worried about someone. Tessa, are you? Is this what you want? Because you've been through a lot in the last 24 hours. Most people wouldn't even be upright after what you did, and now you're jumping straight into a new fire without even taking a breath. Danny, she said, using his first name for the first time. I'm okay. He shook his head. You carried a man out of a canyon on a cut arm after 47 minutes of high-intensity combat shooting. You went in front of a review board on 4 hours of sleep. You had a private meeting with a colonel who was trying to gut your career for his own mistakes. You've been running since before the first RPG hit. He looked at her directly, his gaze hard. I'm not questioning your capability. I know what your capability is. I watched it. I'm asking if you're okay as a person. She looked at him and she gave him the same honesty she'd given Eastwick. No, she said, not completely. Not yet. There are things from yesterday that are going to take a long time to settle. She paused, looking out at the shimmering horizon. But the work is part of how I process. If I sit still too long, the things I'm carrying, they get heavier. They start to press down on me. If I move, if I have something to do that actually matters, it doesn't make it lighter, but it gives me somewhere to put the weight. It gives the pain a purpose. Ruiz was quiet for a long time, the only sound the distant rumble of a generator. Then he nodded. Okay, he said, I get that. I can respect that. He picked up a fresh cleaning patch and went back to work on the SAW. You should know, though, when you're gone, I'm going to tell this story. What story? She asked. The story of the intel analyst who took down 11 positions in 47 minutes, carried a Marine out of a hellhole, and then told a colonel to his face that she was putting every single truth in the formal record. He glanced at her, a glint of defiance in his eyes. That story, Ruiz, don't, she started. I'm going to tell it accurately, he interrupted. I was there for all of it. I have notes, Tessa, real ones. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had made a peace treaty with the truth. People need to know that this is possible. They need to know that someone with the right skill and the right will can walk into a situation that's already been written off as a disaster and change the outcome. That matters beyond this canyon. It matters beyond this deployment. It's a reminder that we aren't just cogs in a machine. She looked at him for a long moment, feeling a strange surge of warmth. "Don't make me sound like a hero," she said. "I'll make you sound like exactly what you are," he countered. "Someone who did the work when the work needed doing." He set the M249 down on the crate. "That's more interesting than a hero anyway. Heroes are icons. You're a reality." She stood up and picked up her rifle case. She looked at Corporal Danny Ruiz, 22 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and the most observant person she'd ever met. She thought about the moment she had told him to open the door of the MRAP and how he had done it without a second of hesitation. He had trusted her when he had no reason to, and she felt the weight of that trust now, as tangible as the rifle in her hand. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "Don't mention it," he said, already looking back at his weapon. "Seriously, I'll deny the whole thing." She walked away, and behind her, the rhythmic, metallic clicking of the SAW being reassembled followed her for several yards. It was a familiar, comforting sound, the sound of a professional at work. She spent the next 3 hours in a blur of necessary tasks. She packed her few personal belongings into a sea bag, submitted her final after-action notes to her section to lock them into the record, and finally allowed a medic to guide her toward the mess tent. The medic had seen her walk past the food line twice and had physically blocked her path until she agreed to sit down and eat an actual meal. She ate the lukewarm tray of food without really tasting it. Her body needed the fuel, but her mind was already miles ahead, hovering over the coordinates of her new assignment. At 15:40, she found herself back on the bench outside the medical tent. Over the last 18 hours, that simple wooden bench had become the site of the most real things in her life. It was where she had confronted the truth, where she had waited for judgment, and where she had finally seen the impact of her actions. She wanted to sit on it one more time before the transport arrived. Pierce found her there, of course. He sat down beside her without preamble, his presence a steady anchor in the shifting winds of the camp. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them staring at the same point in the middle distance. "There's going to be an investigation," Pierce said eventually. "Into Greer, into the route decision, into the lack of overhead support. All of it, it'll take 6 months, maybe a year. It'll be ugly, slow, and bureaucratic. There will be moments when it looks like the whole thing is being buried under a mountain of paperwork." "I know," she said. "Your statement is in the record," he reminded her. "Locke's assessment is there. My documentation is there. Ruiz's notes. Well, he's making sure those are hard to ignore." He paused, his voice dropping into a more reflective tone. "Records have a way of outlasting the people who want them to disappear. Truth is patient." "Do you really believe that?" she asked. "Not just as something you say to comfort people, but do you actually believe it?" Pierce took his time answering. He didn't rush his response, which she had come to learn was how he handled everything that carried real weight. "I believe that doing the right thing in the right way, with documentation, with witnesses, and with a commitment to the formal process, gives the truth the best chance it's ever going to get. It doesn't guarantee the outcome. Nothing in this life guarantees the outcome. But it's the difference between a fight that's possible and one that isn't. You gave this truth a fighting chance, Tessa. That's all you could do. You did it." She nodded slowly, the logic of it settling into her mind. "Pierce," she said, her voice small, "after Kandahar, after the first time you came back from something like this, how long did it take before it felt normal again, before you could walk around without the weight of the canyon being the only thing you felt?" He didn't look at her, but his expression softened. "It doesn't go back to normal," he said. "Normal is what existed before you knew what you know. You can't unknow the things you've seen. You can't unfeel the way it feels to have someone's life in your hands." He paused, a rare moment of transparency from a man who lived behind high walls. "What happens is you build a new normal, one that has the weight built into the structure. You find a way to function, to actually live, not just exist, with all of that as part of who you are. It takes time. It takes work. And it takes having people around you who understand what they're looking at when they see you." He looked at her then, his eyes full of a hard-won wisdom. "You have Ruiz. That's not nothing. He's 22, she reminded him. "Age isn't the thing that matters," Pierce said. "Seeing clearly is the thing that matters. He sees you clearly. And you see yourself clearly now, which is rarer than you think. He stood up and put a hand on her shoulder. It was a brief contact, but it wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was an acknowledgement. It was the physical equivalent of saying, "I see you." Then he removed his hand, straightened his uniform, and looked at her one last time. "Go do the work," he said. "Yes, sir," she replied. He walked away, disappearing into the maze of tents and containers, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She sat for a few more minutes, letting the sounds of the camp wash over her. The roar of departing aircraft, the shout of orders, the clatter of gear. It was an organized chaos that she had once found overwhelming, but now it felt like home. She thought about the silence she had noticed the morning of the ambush. The missing goats, the way the valley seemed to hold its breath. She had known something was coming. She had acted on that knowledge, and because of that, 620 Marines were still breathing. That was permanent. No review board, no JAG filing, and no carefully worded career assessment could ever change that fact. The record of their lives was her real legacy. At 1620, she picked up her rifle case and her sea bag. She walked to the transport staging area, her pace steady and purposeful. She didn't look back at the canyon. She didn't need to. The canyon was already inside her, etched into her memory, sharp-edged and permanent. Ruiz was there at the staging area, standing near the ramp of the C-130. "I thought you were staying with the unit," she said. "I am," he replied. "I just wanted to." He stopped, searching for the right words. "I'm a better Marine for having been in that canyon with you. I want you to know that." She looked at him, seeing the young man who had become a veteran in the span of an afternoon. "You were already a good Marine, Danny," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." He nodded, then extended his hand. She shook it, and it was a simple, powerful gesture. There was no drama to it, just two professionals acknowledging a bond that had been forged in fire. "Stay safe," he said. "You too," she replied. She picked up her gear and climbed the ramp into the cavernous belly of the transport. She found a seat along the side, setting her rifle case across her knees. The familiar weight of the case felt right, a grounding presence in the vibration of the plane. She had first understood what she was capable of when she was 23, and she had spent years worrying that such a capability was a burden. Now she knew better. Capability without application was just a dormant thing. Application was what gave it meaning. The transport lifted off at 1640. Through the small, scratched, bulletproof window, she watched the camp shrink into a tiny grid of tan and green. She watched the valley fall away, and then the mountains began to rise up to meet them. Those same mountains that had stood for eons, indifferent to the small, violent dramas of the humans below. She didn't watch for long. She closed her eyes and felt the vibration of the engines in her teeth. She thought about what Pierce had said, building a new normal. She could feel it happening already, the architecture of her life shifting to accommodate the weight of the last 2 days. She was carrying the canyon now. She was carrying the 11 positions, the 47 minutes, the face of James Eastwick, and the 4 words written in pen on her orders. Her country needs her. It wasn't a slogan to her anymore. It was a directive. The transport flew east, carrying her away from the familiar and toward a future that was unwritten and dangerous. Tessa sat in the dim light of the cargo bay, the rifle case heavy on her knees, and let herself rest. She had 31 hours of exhaustion to clear away, and the work ahead was going to require everything she had. She had more than enough. She had always had more than enough. The canyon hadn't given her strength. It had simply been the place where she finally, undeniably, let it show. As the plane leveled out and the roar of the engines became a steady drone, she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first real peace she had known since the world had ended and begun again in the dirt of the Afghan mountains.